Hey guy, tonight we begin with something very relatable: weddings, or more accurately, what weddings were like in the medieval world, which turns out to be far stranger than most of us could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a medieval village at dawn, the air heavy with the scent of dew-soaked earth, wood smoke curling from thatched roofs like lazy spirits, and the distant bleat of goats stirring the morning mist. The year is somewhere between the 5th and 15th centuries, and marriage in this world is not the dreamy affair of modern rom-coms or fairy tale endings spun by Hollywood bards. It's a contract, a survival strategy, sometimes a diplomatic chess move sealed with wax and whispered promises. Love, if it happens at all, is a pleasant surprise, like finding an extra loaf in the communal oven after a long day's toil. For most, marriage is about assets, land, livestock, lineage, calculated with the precision of a merchant weighing silver coins on a rickety scale. Picture trying to explain to a medieval peasant that one day, people will choose their mates by swiping on glowing screens. They'd likely think you'd been bewitched by a forest sprite or too much ale. By the 12th century, the church, that ever-present narrator of medieval life, declared that mutual consent between bride and groom was enough to make a marriage valid. No priest, no witnesses, just two people agreeing in a hayloft or under a starry sky, their words binding them as surely as iron chains. These clandestine unions, though, were illicit in the church's eyes, like sneaking a second helping of stew and pretending you didn't. The irony is delicious. The same church that preached the sanctity of eternal bonds tied itself in theological knots to explain Mary and Joseph's chaste marriage, making consent a divine loophole. They argued it was the mutual agreement, not the act of consummation, that made a marriage holy, a neat trick to sidestep awkward questions about the Holy Family. Yet consent wasn't always as free as it sounds. Families, especially among the nobility, orchestrated unions with the ruthlessness of generals plotting a siege. A noble girl might be betrothed at 3, wed by 12, her future bartered for an alliance, a castle or a chest of gold. Imagine her, a child barely taller than her father's knee, promised to a boy she'd never met, her dowry already tallied in some dusty ledger. Peasants, bless their hearty souls, had a bit more wiggle room. They might marry for affection after years of shared labor in muddy fields, their hands calloused from the same plow, their hearts warmed by familiarity if not passion. Yet even here, economics whispered in the ear. Could this union merge two scraps of land into something sustainable, or ensure enough hands to tend the pigs through a harsh winter? Age gaps were stark. Noble brides were often children, married off to secure alliances, while peasant women typically waited until their 20s, when they'd saved enough for a humble hearth and a few pots to call their own. It's almost quaint, the medieval equivalent of adulting, postponing matrimony until you could afford your own thatched roof, or at least a corner of your parents' hut. Betrothals were nearly as binding as marriage itself, sealed with tokens like rings, brooches, or even a simple clasp, each carrying the weight of a vow. Breaking one was no light matter. It could spark lawsuits, feuds, or a village-wide scandal, as if you'd reneged on a blood oath sworn under moonlight. Superstitions wove through the process like threads in a tapestry. Dreams of ravens or a sudden storm might derail a match, as if the cosmos cared who shared your straw mattress. A hawk circling overhead could bless the union, while a dead sparrow found on the path was a dire warning. In some regions, families consulted the stars or a local wise woman, hoping the omens aligned for prosperity or strong sons. It's almost comical, this blend of pragmatism and mysticism, as if love were a ledger balanced with grain, celestial signs, and a sprinkle of divine will. The church added its own layer of control, banning marriages within 7 degrees of kinship, later relaxed to 4, to prevent what they called incest, though nobles could by papal dispensations to wed their cousins anyway. Imagine the parchment trail for that loophole, stacks of vellum piling up in some monk's chilly scriptorium, each document a testament to wealth bending the rules. Peasants, with their smaller world of kin, rarely needed such dispensations, but they faced their own hurdles. The church insisted on public bans, read aloud for 3 Sundays, inviting objections like a medieval "speak now or forever hold your peace." Picture the tension in the village church. Would a rival suitor stand up, or a distant cousin reveal a forbidden blood tie? The banns were a public audit, ensuring no hidden spouses or broken vows of celibacy lurked in the shadows. Courtship, if you could call it that, was less about stolen glances and more about supervised signals. A suitor might gift a girl a ribbon or a carved wooden spoon, not as a romantic gesture but as a down payment on intent, while parents haggled over dowries in the background. These tokens were serious business, often blessed to ward off curses or the evil eye. If things went awry, breaking a betrothal could mean repaying gifts or facing a lawsuit in a church court, where clerks scribbled accusations in Latin. In England, these were charmingly called bawdy courts, a name that raises a modern eyebrow but was deadly serious then. It's wryly amusing. In our era of ghosting and unfollowing, medieval folks treated engagements like ironclad treaties, with penalties for desertion as severe as a winter famine. Yet beneath the practicality pulsed a vein of poetry. Troubadours, those wandering minstrels of the South, sang of courtly love, knights pining for unattainable ladies, their hearts aflame with unrequited passion. In reality, such romances rarely led to wedding bells. They were more likely to end in scandal or a mournful lute. For the average couple, the path to marriage wound through community approval and ecclesiastical scrutiny. The church's rules were a tapestry of do's and don'ts, woven with piety and control. No weddings during Lent or Advent, when fasting trumped feasting. Fridays and Sundays were often off-limits, tied to Christ's death or the Sabbath. It's ironic. An institution preaching eternal love micromanaged the calendar, as if God kept a day planner with a quill. This dance of practicality and ritual feels alien yet human. They didn't have dating apps, but they had their own algorithms, family needs, village gossip, and a dash of divine will. Every marriage was a gamble on survival, a pact sealed with hope and a touch of fear. As we drift deeper into this world, let's linger on the negotiations that made these unions possible, where dowries and dowers shaped destinies as much as any vow. The medieval heart, it seems, beat to a rhythm of calculation and dreams, a melody that echoes faintly even now, as you nestle into your pillows and let the story carry you away. Now, let's wander into the smoky halls where marriages were forged, not with poetry or candlelit glances, but with the hard-nosed bargaining of a livestock market. The dowry was the bride's ticket to the altar, a bundle of goods that could make or break a match, as tangible as the mud on a peasant's boots. For nobles, a dowry might include a sprawling estate, a chest brimming with gold coins, or a strategic fiefdom to sweeten an alliance between feuding lords. For peasants, it was humbler but no less vital. A sturdy cow, a clutch of chickens, a sack of barley, or a well-worn spinning wheel that had seen generations of calloused hand. This wasn't just a gift, it was the bride's stake in the marriage, her insurance against widowhood, a promise that she wouldn't be left destitute if her husband met an untimely end in a field or a feud. The groom's family countered with a dower, a portion of property or income set aside for her support if he died first. Think of it as a medieval prenup, but with more livestock and fewer lawyers scrawling on vellum. Picture the scene. A father, his beard flecked with ale, arguing over the value of a dowry while the bride-to-be sits quietly, embroidering a linen shift, her future hinging on whether her family can spare an extra goat or a plot of barley-worthy land. For nobles, the stakes were stratospheric. A marriage could end a border skirmish, secure a trade route, or bind two warring dynasties, and the dowry was the glue that held it together. A bad deal could ruin a family's fortunes, plunge them into debt, or spark a feud that simmered for generations, with swords drawn over a miscalculated hectare. Peasants, meanwhile, haggled with simpler goals. Could this union ensure enough hands to plow the fields, or enough grain to survive a lean winter? It's almost endearing how even the poorest couple weighed their union in bushels and promises, their dreams as grounded as the earth they tilled. The church, never one to miss a chance to meddle, enforced strict rules on consanguinity, banning marriages within 7 degrees of kinship, later relaxed to 4, to keep bloodlines from tangling like a poorly woven tapestry. This was meant to prevent what they called incest, but nobles, with their sprawling family trees, often found themselves inconveniently related to their ideal match. No matter, papal dispensations could be bought with gold, favor, or a well-timed donation to a monastery. Imagine the irony. The church preached moral purity while selling loopholes to the highest bidder, its clerks scribbling dispensations in candlelit scriptoria while muttering about sin. Peasants, with their smaller circles of kin, rarely needed such paperwork, but they faced their own pressure. A lord might demand a fee, known as merchet in England, for a peasant woman to marry, as if love required a feudal stamp of approval. Refusal could mean eviction or worse, a reminder that even the humblest heart answered to someone. Superstitions flavored the dowry dance like herbs in a stew. A bride's dowry might be blessed by a priest to ensure fertility, the coins or cattle sprinkled with holy water as if sanctity could guarantee strong sons. In some regions, contracts were signed under a waxing moon for prosperity, or a sprig of rosemary was tucked into the dowry chest to ward off curses. Breaking a betrothal was no small matter. It could mean repaying the dowry, facing a lawsuit, or enduring a village shunning, as if you'd cursed the harvest itself. In England, church courts, charmingly nicknamed body courts, handled such disputes, their records a litany of broken promises and squabbles over sheep. It's wryly amusing. In our age of casual breakups and blocked numbers, medieval folks treated their engagements like treaties, with breaches as serious as a breached castle wall. Yet there was poetry in this pragmatism. The dowry wasn't just goods, it was a family's hope, a tangible wish for the couple's future. A noblewoman's dowry might include a velvet gown or a silver chalice, symbols of status that whispered of banquets to come. A peasant girl's dowry, though modest, was no less heartfelt. A hand-woven blanket or a copper pot, each item a brick in the foundation of a new home. The dower, too, was a promise, ensuring the bride wouldn't be left penniless if death came early, as it so often did in a world of plague and poorly aimed arrows. Families didn't just marry two people, they merged dynasties or survival strategies, weaving their futures together with coin, land, and whispered prayers. The negotiations could be tense, even theatrical. Picture a noble father pacing a stone hall, his voice rising as he debates the value of a vineyard, while the groom's uncle counters with promises of a dower estate. In peasant homes, the talks were quieter but no less fraught, often held over a shared loaf and a flickering fire. In some regions, the couple themselves had a say, especially among peasants, where a girl might refuse a suitor if the dowry demands felt too steep. Nobles had less freedom, daughters were pawns, their marriages sealing truces or expanding empires. It's a stark contrast to our modern ideals of choice, yet there's a strange beauty in it, a collective effort to build something lasting, even if it was less about love and more about survival. Superstitions didn't stop at the contract. Some families consulted astrologers, hoping Venus's influence would bless the union, while others avoided signing agreements on Fridays, fearing divine displeasure. In parts of France, a dowry chest might be carried through the village in a procession, a public display to ward off the evil eye. If the deal fell apart, the fallout was public too. Gossip spread faster than a market fire, and a jilted party might demand compensation in court or, worse, in a duel. It's a vivid picture, a world where love was a transaction, but one infused with hope, fear, and a touch of magic, as if a well-negotiated dowry could coax fortune from an uncertain future. As we drift from these negotiations, let's turn to the visual splendor of the wedding day itself, where the clothes told stories as vivid as any vow, and every stitch carried the weight of tradition and expectation. Let's pause for a moment, dear listener, to admire the wardrobe of these medieval unions, where every thread and hue whispered secrets of status, superstition, and subtle rebellion. Forget the pristine white gowns that dominate our modern bridal aisles. That's a Victorian invention, as anachronistic to the Middle Ages as a smartphone in a scriptorium. Instead, picture a bride stepping into the flickering light of a church porch, her dress a cascade of deep sapphire blue, symbolizing purity and the Virgin Mary's mantle, or perhaps a vibrant crimson red, evoking wealth, passion, and the fertile blood of life itself. Golds and greens might mingle in the embroidery, nodding to prosperity and the endless cycle of seasons that dictated survival. These colors weren't chosen on a whim. They were talismans, carefully selected to invite fortune and fend off the envious gaze of fate, or worse, the evil eye that lurked in every shadow. For noble brides, the fabrics were a symphony of luxury, sourced from distant lands via treacherous trade routes. Velvet, heavy and soft as a whispered vow, draped over silk or samite, a shimmering weave that caught the light like dewdrops on a spider's web. These materials rustled with every step, announcing the bride's worth to the assembled crowd, their hems trailing through rushes strewn on the floor to mask the scent of unwashed humanity. Imagine the weight of it all, a gown layered with fur trim in colder climes, perhaps ermine or squirrel, to ward off the chill of a drafty cathedral. The sleeves could be a marvel in themselves, long and flowing like banners in a tournament, detachable for practicality or to gift as favors to admirers. It's almost ironic. In an era where women were often seen as vessels for heirs, their wedding attire transformed them into walking fortresses of fabric, both protective and proclaiming. Peasants, of course, made do with humbler threads, but no less meaningful in their earthbound poetry. Linen or wool, spun and woven by calloused hands in the dim light of a cottage fire, formed the basis of a bride's kirtle, a simple, fitted dress that hugged the body before flaring at the hips. Dyes came from the land, wove for blues, madder for reds, or weld for yellows, creating hues that blended with the muddy fields and golden harvests. A peasant bride might borrow her mother's best overdress, patched where moths had nibbled, but starched and pressed to crisp perfection for the day. No extravagance here, yet there was a quiet dignity, a reminder that beauty bloomed in simplicity, much like wildflowers pushing through cracked soil. And oh, the modern comparison. While we fret over designer labels and Instagram-worthy shots, these women donned garments that had stories woven into every seam, tales of family labor and communal thrift. Grooms weren't overlooked in this sartorial saga. They matched their brides in splendor, though with a masculine flair that evolved over the centuries. Early in the period, a tunic over hose sufficed, but by the later Middle Ages, the cotehardie took center stage. A fitted garment hugging the torso before flaring into skirts, the precursor to our modern suits but far more audacious in color and cut. Picture a noble groom in emerald green velvet, his cotehardie slashed to reveal contrasting linings of gold silk, his legs encased in tight hose that left little to the imagination. It's wryly amusing. In a time when modesty was preached from pulpits, men's fashion flirted with the revealing, their codpieces, those padded protrusions, becoming bolder as the centuries waned, a not-so-subtle nod to virility and vigor. Peasants kept it practical. A woolen tunic belted at the waist, perhaps dyed in russet or gray, with sturdy boots caked in the mud of daily toil. Yet even they might add a flourish, a borrowed cloak pinned with a brooch, or a hat adorned with a feather found in the woods. Accessories were the true storytellers, each one laden with symbolism and superstition. For brides, a floral wreath or chaplet crowned the head, woven from rosemary for remembrance, myrtle for love, or wildflowers for fertility, proclaiming her virginity like a living halo. In some regions, only maidens wore these. Widows opted for simpler veils or hoods, a subtle societal nudge toward humility. The veil itself was a must, often of fine gauze or linen, draped to obscure the face and protect against jealous spirits who might covet the bride's joy. Imagine the irony, a sheer barrier against the unseen, as if fabric could foil fate's fickle whims. Belts of silver or embroidered girdles cinched the waist, hung with pouches containing charms, perhaps a relic bone or a dried herb, to ensure fidelity or ward off barrenness. Jewelry sparkled sparingly but significantly. A ring, of course, but also brooches or clasps engraved with vows, saints' names, or lovers' initials, tokens that doubled as amulets against misfortune. Grooms accessorized with purpose too. A belt might hold a dagger, symbolizing protection, or a purse bulging with coins to flaunt solvency. Hats ranged from simple caps for peasants to elaborate chaperones for nobles. Twisted fabrics draped artfully over the shoulder, a fashion statement that screamed sophistication. Gloves, often perfumed with lavender, were exchanged as gifts, their soft leather a promise of gentle hands in marriage. It's poetic, isn't it? These adornments weren't mere decoration. They were armor in a world where omens lurked and every glance could carry a curse. The church, ever the vigilant overseer, had opinions on all this finery. No overly flashy adornments, lest they tempt vanity or provoke divine wrath. Sermons railed against pride, comparing gaudy brides to Jezebel. Yet enforcement was spotty. A noble could flaunt jewels while a peasant escaped notice. Sumptuary laws, those quirky edicts from kings and councils, added another layer. In England and France, these regulations dictated who could wear what. Silk and fur reserved for the elite, purple dyes for royalty alone, fines for upstarts daring to dress above their station. Imagine a merchant's daughter slapped with a penalty for her velvet sleeves, a sartorial class warfare that makes our casual Fridays seem downright egalitarian. Peasants sidestepped much of this, their plain clothes a natural compliance, but nobles pushed boundaries, their weddings a stage for subtle defiance. Regional variations painted the attire in diverse strokes. In Italy, under the Renaissance's budding influence, brides favored brocades heavy with gold thread, their headdresses towering like architectural wonders. Scandinavian grooms might don fur-lined cloaks against the northern chill, while Spanish brides incorporated Moorish silks, their veils edged in intricate lace precursors. Superstitions threaded through it all. A bride avoiding green in some places, lest it invite fairies' mischief, or wearing something borrowed to borrow luck. Pins were taboo, too sharp, too omen-laden, while mirrors were shunned pre-ceremony, fearing they'd capture the soul. As we linger on these garments, it's clear they were more than cloth. They were canvases for hopes, hierarchies, and human quirks. A noble bride's gown might cost a fortune, bankrupting her family for a day's display, while a peasant's dress, handed down through generations, carried the warmth of continuity. In our era of fast fashion and disposable trends, there's a quiet irony in their deliberate choices, each color a prayer, each fabric a pact with destiny. And so, draped in these symbolic shrouds, now let's step gently to the threshold of the church itself, where the heart of the medieval wedding beat in solemn rhythm, not always within the echoing nave but often on the porch, that liminal space where stone met sky and sacred met secular. Picture it, a weathered archway, perhaps carved with saints peering down like nosy neighbors, the air thick with incense wafting from inside and the earthy tang of a gathered crowd outside. This wasn't mere practicality, though yes, it allowed for larger assemblies and spared the holy interior from muddy boots, but a symbolic choice, marking the couple's passage from individual lives into a shared, divinely sanctioned one. In the early Middle Ages, weddings were more civil affairs, but by the 12th century, the church had claimed them as sacraments, insisting on its porch as the stage for vows, a subtle power play to remind all that marriage was God's domain, not just a family contract. The priest, robed in vestments that rustled like ancient scrolls, stood as gatekeeper, his role part inquisitor, part officiant. Before a word of vow was spoken, he'd quiz the couple on impediments, those shadowy barriers that could unravel the union like a poorly knotted thread. "Are you of free will?" he might intone, eyeing them for signs of coercion, perhaps a father's stern glare from the crowd. No secret spouses? No broken vows of celibacy? No forbidden kinship? These questions weren't idle. They were the church's bulwark against scandal, ensuring the marriage aligned with canon law. Imagine the tension, the couple standing there in their finery, hearts pounding as the priest probed, the crowd murmuring like a distant storm. A yes to any impediment could halt everything, leading to annulment or penance, a public humiliation that might scar reputations for generations. The vows themselves echoed through time, sounding eerily familiar to our modern ears. "I take thee to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death us depart." But there was a patriarchal twist. The bride often added to love, cherish, and obey, a nod to the era's hierarchy that makes one wryly ponder how many women whispered it through gritted teeth. The groom, in turn, might pledge provision and protection, his words a contract as binding as any dowry deed. These promises weren't recited from memory alone. The priest guided them, his Latin phrases translated into the vernacular for peasants, ensuring even the illiterate could grasp the gravity. And the ring was the star of this act. Blessed by the priest with holy water and incantations, it was slipped onto the bride's fourth finger, believed to house a vein straight to the heart, a poetic anatomy lesson from antiquity. Gold for nobles, iron or silver for peasants, it symbolized eternity, its circle unbroken like the bond it sealed. Sometimes, a kiss followed, though not always with the passion of a troubadour's tale. Public affection was restrained, a chaste peck to signify consent rather than kindle desire. After all, the church frowned on displays that might veer into lust, that ever-lurking sin. The crowd, a motley assembly of kin, neighbors, and perhaps a wandering minstrel, watched for omens. A sudden sunbeam-piercing clouds might bless the union, while a gust of wind scattering petals could whisper misfortune. Superstitions wove through the ceremony like vines on the church wall. In some regions, the couple clasped hands over a Bible, or the bride stepped forward with her right foot first to invite luck. Evil spirits, those perennial party crashers, were warded off with salt sprinkled at the threshold or bells rung to drown their whispers. After the porch vows, many couples proceeded inside for the nuptial mass, a deeper dive into sanctity reserved for those who could afford it or deemed it necessary. Here, in the dim glow of candles flickering like hesitant stars, the priest elevated the host, and the couple received communion, their union now intertwined with the divine mystery. Incense swirled, chants rose in Latin waves, and the air grew heavy with holiness. For nobles, this might include elaborate blessings, perhaps a papal indulgence if connections ran high. Peasants often skipped the mass, their vows sufficient under the porch's open sky, a pragmatic shortcut in a world where time was measured by sun and season. It's almost charming charming, this tiered spirituality, God's grace scaled to social class, yet equally binding in the eyes of eternity. The banns, those pre-wedding announcements, added a layer of communal drama. Read aloud 3 Sundays prior, they were a public invitation for objections, turning the village into a courtroom of gossip. If any man knows just cause why these two may not be joined, the priest would proclaim and the possibility. A rival suitor claiming prior consent, a long-lost relative unveiling a kinship tie, or even accusations of heresy or impotence. These interruptions weren't rare. Church records brim with tales of halted weddings, leading to investigations that could drag on like a winter famine. The Church's obsession with validity stemmed from its sacramental view. Once married, always married, unless proven otherwise, making prevention better than the cure of annulment. Clandestine marriages, those secretive porchless unions, haunted the edges of this ritual. Valid but illicit, they bypassed the pomp, often forged in haste or passion, like a couple exchanging vows in a moonlit grove. The Church despised them, fearing they bred bigamy or regret, and imposed penalties like fines or public penance. Yet they persisted, a testament to human impulsiveness in a regulated world. Imagine a young pair, hearts aflame, whispering promises without witnesses, only to face ecclesiastical wrath later. It's wryly ironic. The institution that exalted consent also demanded spectacle, as if love needed an audience to be real. Regional flavors spiced the ceremony. In England, the porch was paramount, while in Italy, grander cathedrals hosted the vows inside, amid frescoes of saints judging from walls. Scandinavian couples might incorporate pagan echoes, like oaths on a hammer for Thor's blessing, tolerated if Christianized. Eastern Europe saw Orthodox influences, with crowns held over heads symbolizing martyrdom in marriage, a poetic if daunting metaphor. Superstitions varied too. A French bride might carry bread for abundance, while a German groom avoided looking back after vows, lest he invite regret. The role of witnesses was crucial, their presence turning private words into public fact. Nobles invited dignitaries, their signatures on charters affirming the union's legality, while peasants relied on villagers, their memories as binding as ink. Gifts might be exchanged here, a coin from groom to bride, symbolizing provision, or a Bible for shared devotion. The ceremony's end often blurred into celebration, the couple emerging to cheers or the clang of makeshift bells, rice or grains tossed for fertility, a messy benediction that stuck to veils and tunics alike. In this porch-bound drama, we see the medieval soul laid bare, a blend of faith, fear, and formality, where vows were chains of gold or iron, depending on one's station. The Church orchestrated it all, its rules a safety net against chaos, yet humans slipped through with their secrets and superstition. As the couple turned from the threshold, hand in hand, they stepped into a life scripted by society but improvised by fate. Now, as the echoes of vows fade into the crisp air outside the church porch, let's follow the newlyweds and their entourage to the true climax of the day, the wedding feast, where solemnity surrendered to the senses, and the medieval world revealed its earthy appetite for joy. Imagine the scene shifting from stone sanctity to a bustling hall or open village green, tables groaning under the weight of platters, the air thick with the savory aroma of roasted meats mingling with the sweet tang of spiced wine. This wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual of abundance, a communal exhale after the tension of ceremonies, where bellies were filled as surely as alliances were sealed. In a time when famine lurked like a shadow at every harvest, a wedding feast was a defiant proclamation. Today, at least, we have plenty, and tomorrow's worries can wait. For nobles, the banquet was a spectacle of excess, a stage where wealth flexed its muscles amid flickering torchlight and tapestries depicting heroic deeds. Picture a grand hall in a stone castle, long oak tables draped in linen cloths, white for purity, if they could afford the dye, and laden with courses that unfolded like chapters in a lavish manuscript. The first might be a subtle tease, fresh breads baked with saffron, their golden crusts cracking under eager fingers, served with herbed butters or dripping honeycombs. Then came the meats, roasted boar, its tusks gilded for drama, or swan stuffed with figs and nuts, its feathers reattached post-cooking in a bizarre resurrection of elegance. Venison pies burst with gravy spiced by exotic imports like cinnamon and cloves, remnants of crusader trade routes that brought the East's mysteries to European plates. It's wryly amusing. In an era of rigid class divides, even the food strutted its status, with subtleties, sugar sculptures molded into castles or mythical beasts, towering as edible art, only to be demolished by delighted guests. Wine and ale flowed like rivers in flood, poured from silver ewers into goblets that clinked in toasts to fertility and fortune. Mead, honey-sweet and potent, was a favorite for its nod to ancient rites, while Hippocras, a spiced wine mulled with ginger and pepper, warmed the blood and loosened tongues. The church, ever watchful, wagged a finger at drunkenness, especially if the wedding fell near a holy day, but enforcement was as lax as a tipsy bishop's sermon. Guests, from allied lords to distant kin, numbered in the hundreds, their seating a careful choreography of politics. Rivals separated, favorites honored with seats near the high table. Entertainment wove through the meal. Jugglers tossing flaming brands, acrobats twisting like vines, or a fool in motley capering with bawdy jests that skirted the edge of propriety. It's almost poetic, this blend of gluttony and grace, where a noble feast could last days, each course a flex against mortality, in a world where half the population teetered on starvation's brink. Peasants, in their simpler realms, crafted feasts from the land's humble bounty, but with no less heart or ingenuity. Gather under a thatched barn or a shady oak on the village green, where the community pooled resources like threads in a communal quilt. A pig, fattened on acorns and scraps, might be the centerpiece, roasted whole over a spit turned by eager children, its crackling skin shared among all. Stews simmered in iron cauldrons, thick with root vegetables, turnips, carrots, leeks, mingled with whatever game the woods provided. Rabbit or pigeon, flavored with wild garlic and thyme plucked from hedgerows. Bread, coarse and hearty from rye or barley, formed the backbone, often baked in a communal oven fired up for the occasion. Pottages, those one-pot wonders, bubbled with peas, beans, and bits of salted pork, a nourishing sludge that sustained through lean times but shone on wedding days with extra herbs or a splash of ale. Drinks were straightforward but abundant. Small beer for the young and wary, stronger ale for the merry, brewed in village vats with hops or grut, a mix of bog myrtle and yarrow for bitterness and buzz. Cider pressed from orchard apples added a fruity tang in fruit-bearing regions, while water, if served, was boiled with mint to mask any dubious purity. The feast was a reciprocal affair. Guests brought contributions, a wheel of cheese, a basket of eggs, a flagon of mead, turning the meal into a potluck of survival. Seating was egalitarian, benches crowded with neighbors and kin, laughter echoing as stories flowed freer than the drink. No hired entertainers here, but local talent, a farmer with a fiddle scratching out tunes, or villagers linking arms in impromptu songs, their voices rough but resonant with shared history. Superstitions seasoned the feast like hidden spices. Bread might be broken over the bride's head, crumbs raining down as a fertility charm, symbolizing abundance in children and crops alike. In some corners of Europe, the couple shared a single trencher, a slab of stale bread serving as a plate, their fingers brushing in a subtle intimacy amid the chaos. Guests tossed grains or nuts at the newlyweds, a messy benediction for prosperity, while avoiding spilled salt, that harbinger of tears. The groom might cut the first slice of a special cake, often a fruited bread rather than our sugary confections, distributing pieces for luck, single women tucking them under pillows to dream of future husbands. It's lightly sarcastic to note, in our era of Instagram-perfect receptions with tiered fondant towers, medieval folks found magic in crumbs and crust, their rituals as grounded as the soil they tilled. Differences between classes sharpened the irony. Noble feasts could bankrupt lesser lords, with imported delicacies like peacocks served in plumage or lampreys in jelly, while peasants reveled in what the season offered, their joy unadorned but authentic. Yet both shared the feast's core purpose, binding the community. For nobles, it was a display of largesse, gifts of food or coin to servants reinforcing hierarchy. Peasants used it to affirm village ties, the meal a safety net where alliances formed over shared bites. Health concerns lurked. Overeating led to gout among the rich, dysentery from dubious water for the poor, but merriment prevailed, the feast a brief utopia in a harsh world. Regional twists added flavor. In Italy, pasta precursors like lasagna appeared at wealthier tables, sauced with cheese and herbs, while Scandinavian feasts featured smoked fish and rye porridges against the northern chill. French nobles indulged in escargot or foie, early hints of culinary refinement, and English peasants favored wassail bowls of spiced ale passed hand to hand. The church's bans on meat during certain seasons forced fish-heavy menus, turning necessity into novelty with eel pies or herring stews. As the sun dipped or torches guttered, the feast blurred into dance and song, but we'll linger here a moment longer, savoring the aftertaste. These banquets were more than sustenance. They were statements, where plenty mocked scarcity and community triumphed over isolation. In our fast food age, There's a soothing poetry in their deliberate indulgence, a reminder that even in mud and mead, humans have always feasted to forget the famine. And so, with bellies full and spirits high, let's sway now to the music and dance, where feet and traditions twirled in merry chaos under the stars or vaulted ceilings. As the feast's last crumbs are swept away and the ale mugs sit half-drained, let's sway into the heart of the medieval wedding's revelry, the music and dance, where the day's solemn vows dissolved into a whirl of sound and movement. Picture the scene shifting from laden tables to an open space, perhaps a castle's great hall, its stone walls hung with tapestries that flicker in torchlight, or a village green, where stars overhead compete with the glow of bonfires. The air hums with the twang of strings, the pulse of drums, and the laughter of a crowd ready to shake off the weight of ceremony. In the medieval world, from the 5th to 15th centuries, music and dance weren't just entertainment. They were rituals of unity, stitching the couple into their community with every note and step, a chaotic celebration that blurred the lines between sacred and profane. For nobles, music was a display of refinement, as much a flex of wealth as the banquet's gilded swan. Minstrels, hired from far-off courts or wandering troops, strummed lutes, plucked harps, or piped on shawms, those reedy, nasal ancestors of the oboe that could pierce the din of a crowded hall. Their songs ranged from soulful ballads praising the couple's virtues to jaunty tunes that teased the groom's courage or the bride's beauty, often with a wink at their future together. In southern France, troubadours might weave tales of courtly love, their lyrics dripping with longing for an idealized beloved, though such romance rarely matched the arranged marriages at hand. The church, ever the spoilsport, insisted on decorum. No lewd lyrics or pagan echoes, they decreed, fearing melodies that might summon older, earthier spirits. But enforcement was as patchy as a peasant's cloak. After a few goblets of spiced wine, even bishops might tap their feet to a ribald refrain. Peasants relied on local talent, their music raw but no less vibrant. A farmer with a knack for the viol, a medieval fiddle, might lead the charge, its strings scratched into lively jigs that set boots stomping. A shepherd's pipe, carved from willow, or a homemade drum crafted from a beryl skin could carry the tune, while a village girl with a voice like a lark sang of harvests and hearth. These weren't polished performances but communal outbursts, where everyone knew the refrain and mistakes were drowned in laughter. The instruments were simple, bagpipes wheezing like a tired ox or a hurdy-gurdy's droning crank, but they wove a soundscape that bound the crowd, from toothless elders to children darting underfoot. It's almost poetic. In our era of curated playlists and Bluetooth speakers, these villagers found harmony in the imperfections of hand-hewn music, their notes as earthy as the soil they tilled. Dances varied by region and class, each a choreography of culture and caution. Among nobles, the pavane reigned supreme in later centuries, a stately procession of gliding steps where couples moved like chess pieces, their velvet sleeves brushing in deliberate grace. The carol, a circular dance with hands clasped, was popular across classes, its communal whirl a symbol of unity that could include lords and servants alike. In France, the bransel brought livelier hops and kicks, while English peasants favored round dances, their feet pounding patterns into the grass. Imagine a village green at dusk, clogs thudding in rhythm, skirts swirling as dancers dodged spilled ale and stray chickens. For nobles, the dance floor was a stage for politics, alliances hinted at in who partnered whom, rivalries sparked by a snubbed hand. Peasants danced for joy, their movements less about status and more about release, though a clumsy step could still draw good-natured jeers. Superstitions swirled through the music and movement like smoke from the fire. A misstep during the couple's first dance might foretell a rocky marriage, as if fate judged their footwork. In some regions, the bride and groom led the opening round, their clasped hands a public vow of harmony, while guests watched for omens. A stumble meant discord, a smooth twirl promised peace. In Germany, a broken lute string was a bad sign, while in Italy, a clear note from a flute heralded joy. Some couples danced under a canopy of woven branches, a nod to fertility and growth, or avoided crossing a threshold mid-dance, lest it invite spirits to meddle. The bride might toss her garland into the crowd, a precursor to our bouquet toss, with single women scrambling for it, believing it carried luck for their own weddings. It's wryly amusing. We toss bouquets for fun, but they chase them with the fervor of a talisman hunt, as if a sprig of rosemary could summon a husband. Regional flavors spiced the revelry. In Scotland, reels spun with wild energy, dancers weaving through sword-crossed patterns that echoed warrior tradition. Italian courts favored the saltarello, a leaping dance that mimicked the joy of a bountiful harvest. Eastern Europe brought Slavic influences, with stomping dances that shook wooden floors, while Scandinavian couples might circle a fire, a vestige of Viking rites tamed by Christian overlay. The church tolerated these, barely, as long as the lyrics didn't stray too far into pagan territory or the steps too close to lasciviousness. Yet the line was blurry. After enough mead, a peasant's jig could look suspiciously like a fertility rite, and even nobles weren't above a suggestive sway. The community's role was as vital here as at the feast. For peasants, everyone joined in, from the blacksmith to the midwife, their dances a shared pulse that knit the village tighter. Nobles invited select guests, vassals, allies, or rival lords, each step a diplomatic gesture, each refusal a slight. Children darted through, mimicking adults or stealing sips of ale, while elders clapped from benches, their memories weaving past weddings into the present. The music didn't just entertain, it unified, a thread pulling disparate lives into one tapestry. Even the clumsiest dancer was part of the story, their missteps forgiven in the haze of celebration. As the night wore on, the line between order and chaos blurred. A noble hall might descend into raucous toast, with goblets spilled and minstrels drowned out by laughter. On the village green, dances spilled into the dark, fueled by ale and starlight, until exhaustion or dawn called a halt. It's a vivid contrast to our choreographed receptions, where every song is cued and every step planned. There's a raw beauty in their abandon, a reminder that even in a world of rigid rules, humans craved the freedom to spin, laugh, and lose themselves in rhythm. The dance was more than merriment. It was a bridge from the sacred to the secular, from vows to victory over the day's wait. As feet slowed and voices hushed, the couple might steal a moment, their hands lingering in the final turn, eyes meeting in a flicker of shared fate. And so, with the music fading into the night's embrace, let's wander now to the laws that govern these unions, where the church and crown played judge, jury, and occasionally matchmaker, ensuring love, or at least marriage, bent to their will. If there is one thing the Middle Ages adored, it was rules. Rules for eating fish, rules for wearing certain colors, rules for how many geese you were legally allowed to own if you were a miller on the wrong side of the river. And, of course, rules for how love should be regulated, which is precisely what made medieval marriages less about romance and more about surviving a bureaucratic gauntlet wrapped in parchment. The church, as the self-appointed referee of human intimacy, imposed an elaborate web of restrictions on who could marry whom. For example, the concept of consanguinity, the degree of relatedness between two people, was stretched to near comedic length. By the 11th century, the church declared that no one could marry within 7 degrees of kinship, which in practice meant nearly everyone in a village was off-limit. Because let's be honest, the dating pool was shallow when your entire world extended about 5 muddy miles in every direction. If you think modern background checks are intrusive, imagine trying to prove you weren't secretly fourth cousins once removed to the shepherd girl down the lane. Enter the genealogical inquisition, a spectacle where families and neighbors testified about how they remembered your great-great-grandmother's cousin's cow being shared between households. Love, in short, was a public hearing. And then there were the forbidden times of the year. The church had holy seasons when marriage was deemed inappropriate. Lent, Advent, and about 1/3 of the calendar, really. Because nothing says spiritual devotion like postponing your wedding until after the saints and fasting had their turn. For nobles, laws became even stranger. Kings and lords often received petitions begging for annulment. Suddenly, a marriage that had been politically advantageous last year was no longer convenient this year. Suddenly, a spiritual defect was discovered, or a forgotten cousinship that mysteriously invalidated the union. Canon law bent in curious ways when titles and land were at stake. Peasants, meanwhile, often ignored half of these rules. If two people lived together long enough and everyone in the village accepted them as married, well, what was the priest going to do? Walk door to door handing out citations? The law might say one thing, but daily life often said another. Thus, medieval marriage laws were less about guiding love than about controlling society. Who inherited land, who paid which tithe, and who got the blessing of legitimacy stamped onto their children. And as always, where there is bureaucracy, there is comedy, because nothing undermines romance quite like needing permission from both your bishop and your neighbor's memory of a cow. One of the more curious and, frankly, theatrical aspects of medieval marriage was not the vows, not the feast, not even the dancing, but the bedding ceremony. Imagine if, after your wedding reception today, all your friends and family followed you home, marched into your bedroom, and stood around the bed making jokes, prayers, and sometimes lewd commentary while you lay there awkwardly pretending to be asleep. Congratulations, you have just been married, Middle Ages style. The bedding ceremony was at once sacred, social, and comedic, a peculiar blend of genuine ritual and outright entertainment. For peasants, it might be as simple as neighbors escorting the newlyweds to a shared straw mattress, tossing some rye or oats over them as a symbol of fertility, and wishing them luck with producing children that would hopefully live past the age of 5. But for the nobility, Bedding was transformed into an elaborate performance with costumes, songs, and a very keen audience. The public escort. It began with the leading to the bed. After the feast, which often left everyone tipsy on ale or wine, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber. This was not done quietly. Oh no, there was music, cheering, clapping, sometimes the blowing of horns or banging of pots. The noise was meant to be celebratory, yes, but also to ward off evil spirit. Medieval people loved to multitask their rituals, keep the devils away, encourage fertility, and keep the neighbors entertained, all in one noisy parade. For high-ranking nobles, this escort might include bishops and dukes in full regalia, walking solemnly behind the giggling couple. One can only imagine the mix of solemn faces and drunken laughter echoing in a drafty castle hall. The bed as a stage. Once inside, the newlyweds were not simply left alone. Instead, they were tucked in literally. Priests or attendants might bless the bed with holy water. In some regions, the couple lay down fully dressed, while witnesses looked on to ensure the union was legal. In others, clothing was loosened, and jokes were made loudly to remind everyone of what was expected to happen once the chamber doors were finally closed. It was, in many ways, less about romance and more about contract verification. The marriage had to be consummated for it to be valid, and consummation, awkwardly enough, required witnesses. Sometimes these witnesses remained in the room until they were satisfied things were proceeding as planned. Sometimes they simply lingered outside the chamber door, ears pressed shamelessly to the wood, waiting for proof in the form of noises, sighs, or the appearance of rumpled sheets the next morning. Privacy, in the medieval mind, was not nearly as sacred as it is today. Symbolism everywhere. Of course, like everything in the Middle Ages, symbolism mattered. Beds might be sprinkled with flowers or herbs believed to encourage fertility, rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, and of course, wheat for abundance. Sometimes a child, usually a boy because patriarchy never missed a chance to promote itself, was placed on the bed before the couple, symbolizing the hope for many heirs. The gesture was less subtle encouragement and more unsubtle command. This is what you're supposed to do tonight. Don't mess it up. In France, the priest might even bless the sheets, ensuring not only spiritual sanctity but also a kind of divine warranty over the night's activity. In England, neighbors sometimes played rougher jokes, sneaking into the room to bang pans or shouting ribald rhymes through the shutters, making sure the couple's first moments together were accompanied by the medieval equivalent of a laugh track. The noble spectacle. For royal and aristocratic marriages, bedding could become almost absurdly formal. Chroniclers describe kings and queens being led to their chambers while entire courts looked on. Curtains were drawn back so the bed could be displayed like a stage prop. Nobles crowded in, offering toasts, prayers, and occasionally ribbing commentary. The bride, often a teenager married off for alliance purposes, might be pale with nerves. The groom, perhaps twice her age and politically anxious, might grin awkwardly while courtiers jostled for the best view. Then the curtains were closed, the candles extinguished, but make no mistake, the room was rarely truly empty. And the next day, there was proof to be provided. Sometimes, a blood-stained sheet was triumphantly displayed, paraded like a banner of honor. Sometimes, discreet servants carried the evidence to waiting family members. This strange fixation was less about romance and more about property law. The marriage had to be consummated to secure inheritance and prevent disputes. Love was nice, but legitimacy was essential. Peasant variations. Among peasants, bedding was less ceremonial but no less communal. A village might carry the couple to bed, sing bawdy songs, and then leave them to their privacy, though privacy often meant a one-room cottage with family members sleeping nearby. Imagine trying to begin married life with your in-laws snoring 3 feet away. But then, medieval life rarely afforded solitude. In some places, neighbors would play pranks, tying the couple's door shut, placing obstacles in the room, or hiding their clothes. It was all in good fun, a reminder that marriage was not just a union between two individuals but a contract witnessed and upheld by the entire community. The blurring of sacred and comic. What is most striking about the bedding ceremony is its odd duality. On the one hand, it was solemn, priests blessing the bed, sacred words spoken, holy water sprinkled. On the other, it was irreverent, laughter, songs, pranks, and open mockery of the most private of acts. Medieval people lived in a world where sacred and profane constantly overlapped. Life itself was precarious and often absurd, so perhaps it made sense that even the act of beginning a family was treated as part holy ritual, part comedy show. Echoes of control. Ultimately, the bedding ceremony reveals how marriage was never just about two people. It was about families, communities, inheritance, fertility, and the ever-present church. By making consummation a public matter, society claimed ownership over the most intimate part of human life. The couple might have whispered dreams of love, but the world outside their bed was always listening, always watching. And yet, despite the awkwardness, perhaps there was comfort in it too. The couple did not enter their new life alone. They carried with them the laughter, the prayers, the teasing, and the expectations of everyone they knew. Love may not have been private, but it was shared, witnessed, and woven into the fabric of the community. Under the flicker of candles and the fading echoes of laughter from the wedding feast, the medieval marriage moved into its next phase, a quieter, though not necessarily more comfortable, chapter. Once the bedding ceremony was complete, whether with solemn blessing, drunken jests, or both, the newlyweds awoke into the world of obligation. Marriage was never only about two hearts finding each other. In the Middle Ages, it was as much a legal arrangement as it was a personal one, and the morning after came with duties that went far beyond adjusting to a new partner beside you in bed. What followed was the slow settling of roles, of property, and of expectation. If you were a noblewoman, your marriage had quite literally been a transfer of wealth. You carried with you the dowry, carefully negotiated in advance, a sum that might include land, livestock, or a glittering chest of coins. Overnight, you were now installed in your husband's household, a stranger to its rhythms and its politics. The servants who once deferred to your mother now looked to your mother-in-law. The kitchen smells were unfamiliar, the chapel bells rung to a different pattern, and you were expected to fit seamlessly into a new web of alliances. For the peasant woman, the change was just as abrupt, though on a humbler scale. Marriage meant leaving one cottage for another, perhaps only a field or two away. Yet even the short journey carried weight. You now joined a different family with different customs, different sleeping arrangements, and different demands. It was no small matter when every hand counted in the daily battle for survival. Your new husband's family would want to know how well you could spin, bake, plant, or manage a cow. You were not just a bride, you were new labor folded into the household economy. The man, too, found himself under scrutiny. Marriage was his moment to prove he could sustain a household, that he could support not only a wife but, in time, children. In towns, guilds often required proof that a craftsman was married before he could rise in rank. The assumption was clear. A wife kept order at home, allowing the husband to dedicate himself fully to his trade. A bachelor might be dismissed as unreliable, but a married man was seen as stable, anchored, and respectable. It was less about romance than about efficiency. Daily life for a married couple rarely offered the privacy that modern couples take for granted. Noble houses buzzed with courtiers, priests, and servants. Peasant cottages rattled with siblings, children, and animals. The married bed itself was rarely a sanctuary. In smaller homes, the entire family might share one space, divided only by a curtain or a thin partition. Chickens pecked by the hearth, goats bleated in the yard, and the creak of the bed was never a secret. Privacy was a luxury almost unknown, and intimacy existed under the constant gaze of community. For nobles, marriage also meant public scrutiny of a different sort. A bride might be appraised at every dinner table, her fertility whispered about by ladies-in-waiting, her conduct assessed by priests. If a year passed without a child, murmurs began. Was she barren? Was the husband at fault? Whispers could erode reputations and even threaten dynasties. In such cases, midwives, doctors, and priests might all be called to investigate, turning the private struggles of a couple into the business of an entire court. Children were not just desired, they were expected. Marriage existed, above all, to secure heirs. For peasants, this meant more hands for labor, even if childhood was perilously fragile. For lords and kings, heirs meant continuity of power and stability of inheritance. It was not unusual for couples, particularly noble ones, to be reminded again and again of their duty to the family line. The bed was not only a place of comfort, but a battlefield where legitimacy was won or lost. Yet, amid the weight of these expectations, there were small spaces for tenderness. Chronicles and letters, rare as they are, suggest that some couples did indeed form deep bonds. A peasant man might carve a small wooden token for his wife to wear. A noblewoman might write in her book of hours, slipping in a private prayer for her husband's health. Love, in its quiet, unrecorded forms, flickered beneath the grand machinery of family duty and inheritance. It did not drive marriages, but it sometimes grew within them. In the mornings after weddings, rituals continued. Gifts were exchanged between families, meals were shared, and prayers offered for the fertility of the union. The entire community had invested in the marriage, and they expected to see its fruits. Villagers who had cheered as the couple was led to bed might stop by in the following days to share a drink or to help with chores, weaving the new marriage into the fabric of village life. Nobles held more formal receptions, with diplomats and clerics pressing in to finalize treaties and alliances, while bards sang songs of union and heralds proclaimed new ties. Marriage was not a private affair. It was communal property. The couple themselves were only one part of the story, often the least important. Families, villages, and kingdoms stood behind them, their hopes and their demands pressing into every shared meal, every whispered conversation, every sleepless night. To marry in the medieval world was to step into a role that everyone else had scripted long before you spoke your vow. And yet, for all its structure and rigidity, marriage was also a source of stability in a precarious age. To share a bed, even one crowded with children or with thin straw poking through the mattress, was still to share warmth. To divide bread at the end of a long day's labor was still to feel that life's burdens were carried together. Amid the political calculations and the communal expectations, there were still moments when two people found comfort in each other's presence, small sparks of companionship in a world often ruled by necessity. So the morning after the wedding was not an ending but a beginning. The feast was over, the jokes faded, the chamber curtains drawn back to the harsh light of daily life. What remained was the quiet work of living together, of weaving two lives into one household, of learning to endure, of striving to meet the demands of family, church, and community. Medieval marriage was never just about love, but it was also never entirely without it. Somewhere between the public spectacle and the private bed, between duty and desire, the couple began the long work of being married. The marriage feast might have ended, the bedding ceremony whispered about, and the obligations of daily life already beginning to creep in, but the union itself was not a moment, it was a process reinforced, watched, and constantly interpreted by the medieval world around it. If the vows at the church porch had bound two people together, everything that came afterward was the ongoing test of whether they could hold. A marriage was not signed and sealed on a single day. It was lived, examined, and measured in years, sometimes painfully so. In the noble halls, marriage functioned like a ledger. You could read it in the titles of land, in the alliances written into treaties, in the lists of dowry goods exchanged like soldiers in a campaign. If a noblewoman brought with her a chest of silver, she had delivered power into her husband's family line. If she brought fertile estates, orchards, or a village, she had brought revenue streams, soldiers, and leverage. Her body and her fortune became one in the same breath. She herself, meanwhile, had been moved like a pawn on a board, positioned to reinforce the family's power. If she was fortunate, her husband would treat her with courtesy, perhaps even affection. If not, her duty remained the same, to produce heirs and to preserve dignity. For peasants, the terms were simpler but no less binding. A marriage was not recorded in court ledgers, but in the practicalities of who plowed which field, who helped with the harvest, who mended the roof. A marriage was tested in the cold months, when bread ran low, when livestock grew thin, when the children were sick. It was easy to make vows in the warmth of a feast hall. It was another thing entirely to honor them when snow piled against the door. A man might judge his wife not by jewels but by the strength of her hands at the spinning wheel. A woman might judge her husband not by lineage but by whether he could keep food on the table in February. The church, of course, hovered over all of this. Marriage was not simply social, it was spiritual, a sacrament. The priest had declared it indissoluble. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That sounded lofty in Latin, but in practice it meant there was no easy exit. Divorce, as we understand it, was not available. Annulments could be granted, yes, but they required grounds that were often arcane. Proof of consanguinity, that the couple was too closely related, which happened often in small villages and noble families alike. Evidence that the marriage had not been consummated, or claims of coercion. All of these required witnesses, money, and connections. For most people, once the vows were said, the path forward was singular. You were bound. This permanence gave the medieval marriage its peculiar mixture of gravity and irony. Everyone knew that two people might not even like each other, and yet they were sealed for life. The community saw this, accepted it, and treated it as normal. Gossip flourished, certainly. Married couples who bickered too loudly became fodder for jokes at the alehouse. A wife who seemed too free with her glances drew whispers. A husband who drank away his household's resources was scorned. But still, the institution itself was unquestioned. Marriage was the foundation of order, not merely between two people, but for the entire village, manor, or kingdom. One of the great fears that shadowed every medieval marriage was infidelity, or at least the suspicion of it. The double standard was as old as the stones in the church wall. A man's affair, while frowned upon, could often be smoothed over with coin or influence, especially if he was noble. A woman's supposed straying, however, was dangerous beyond measure. For nobles, it threatened the legitimacy of heirs. For peasants, it threatened the fragile trust of family labor. And so women lived under particular scrutiny, their bodies and reputations tightly monitored by husbands, families, and neighbors. Yet within these constraints, couples carved out rhythms of their own. The household was both battlefield and sanctuary, and most marriages did not erupt in scandal, but trudged forward through habit, shared work, and mutual need. A wife might wake before dawn to tend the hearth, to knead bread, to milk the cow. A husband might rise to chop wood or walk out into the frost to check the field. Children stumbled sleepily into the day, and life went on. Disputes arose, of course, over money, over in-laws, over small slights, but the effort of survival often outweighed the luxury of holding grudges. For the nobility, life was somewhat different, though no less fraught. A noble marriage was under constant observation. Ambassadors watched closely. Was the alliance strong? Was the marriage harmonious enough to signal stability? Court poets composed verses about marital bliss, whether or not it existed. Servants reported whispers from behind closed doors. Marital discord at this level could shake kingdoms, topple dynasties, and ignite wars. Thus, even the coldest couples were forced to present a performance of harmony. Behind the scenes, there might be rivalry, bitterness, or even hatred, but before the watching eyes of Europe, the noble couple must dine together, walk together, and nod politely across rooms filled with courtiers. And still, there were exceptions. A few marriages, almost miraculously, found genuine affection. Chronicles preserve the rare letters of a noble husband to his wife, describing her as his beloved companion. In village records, one finds widowers donating to churches in memory of wives who had kept the household afloat for decades. In these cases, love had not led to marriage, but marriage, over time, had fostered something like love. A bond of endurance, of familiarity, sometimes even of tenderness, grew in the shadows of obligation. The medieval marriage was, at its heart, pragmatic. It was a machine that turned social necessity into daily habit. Yet to dismiss it as nothing but duty would be to miss the texture of human life within it. People still laughed, still argued, still felt the sharp pangs of jealousy and the quiet warmth of affection. Even in a world where marriage was a tool of politics and economics, it was also a theater for all the same emotions that trouble and comfort us today. As the weeks turned into months after the wedding, the couple became less a spectacle and more a part of the scenery. The villagers stopped pointing when they walked together. The servants learned their new routines. The gossip moved on to fresher targets. They became, in the most ordinary sense, married. Their story faded into the countless others that formed the hum of medieval life. And yet, within that ordinariness, the great machinery of society continued to turn, powered by the marriages that linked family to family, farm to farm, throne to throne. Marriage was not the end of a story, it was the infrastructure of a civilization. Each vow spoken under the church porch held up, in some small way, the walls of medieval Europe. And whether happy or unhappy, noble or humble, ordinary or infamous, every marriage contributed to the fabric that kept the world in place. That was its power. That was its burden. Marriage in the medieval world was never entirely private. To be married was not only to live with another person under the same roof. It was to step into a constant stage where neighbors, priests, and family members played their parts as audience and judge. The wedding feast had been a public display. The vows at the church porch had been witnessed by all, and even after the marriage bed grew cold, the community continued to hover in expectation. A man and a woman were no longer individual. They were a pair, woven into the larger tapestry, and the stitches were inspected at every turn. Superstition made this scrutiny even more vivid. The medieval mind, attuned to signs, omens, and the invisible hand of the divine, clothed marriage in a thick fabric of ritual and precaution. To marry in the wrong season was unlucky. May, for instance, was considered a poor choice, a month tainted by old Roman associations with the dead. Better to wed in January, when the cold was sharp but the year promised new beginnings. Days of the week mattered too. Wednesday was thought ideal, while Friday, forever marked by Christ's passion, was ill-fated. A couple married on a Friday risked carrying the weight of sorrow into their union. And then there were the objects. A shoe placed under the bed was said to ensure fertility. A sprig of rosemary woven into a bride's hair promised loyalty. Bells were rung loudly, not merely to announce celebration but to drive away spirits who might creep into the marital bed. The church frowned upon such charms, of course, but the church also tolerated them. Better that a marriage survive with a little pagan garnish than to falter under doubt. The bride herself bore the heaviest load of these traditions. She was both sacred and symbolic, at once a vessel of grace and a fragile target for misfortune. Her hair was often veiled, not only for modesty but to shield her from the wandering eyes of envious spirits. When she entered her husband's home, she might be lifted over the threshold so that her foot did not touch ill luck lingering in the doorway. Guests might throw grain or herbs over her, gestures that looked to us like quaint celebration but were, in fact, fierce magical protections, seeds of plenty hurled against the threat of barrenness. Peasant weddings clung to such rituals more stubbornly, for life at that level was bound tightly to the caprice of the seasons. A failed crop or a barren womb could destroy a family. Thus, every charm, every superstition was pressed into service. A bride might hide a small coin in her shoe, hoping it would bring prosperity. A groom might carry a piece of iron in his pocket to ward away the lurking malice of the unseen. Even laughter and song had protective power. Guests were expected to be noisy, rowdy, even slightly chaotic, so that ill-willed spirits could not creep in unnoticed. Noble weddings, by contrast, embroidered these folk traditions with grandeur, but the fears were the same. The bride, dressed in silk or velvet, might wear beneath her finery a simple herb sprig tucked into her sleeve, the same kind of talisman her peasant counterpart would wear. In castles, bells might be rung or cannons fired to drown out evil influences, a louder echo of the village practice. It was an odd, almost touching continuity. Whether in manor or hut, couples believed they were fragile creatures in a hostile world, needing all the help they could gather to shield their union. Once married, the daily life of a couple continued to be framed by ritual. The first night together was not simply biology, it was theology and superstition interwoven. The consummation of the marriage was expected, sometimes even witnessed by attendants or confirmed by the presentation of blood-stained sheets. Yet, hidden beneath this grim spectacle were charms whispered in private, candles lit to ensure children, prayers muttered against impotence, herbs burned for fertility. Failure to consummate was not merely personal embarrassment, it was grounds for annulment, a threat to the entire alliance or household. Thus, the first night was heavy with layers of expectation, practical and mystical alike. Children, of course, were the next concern, and here the rituals multiplied. A wife who conceived quickly was praised as favored by God. One who did not might seek charms or pilgrimages. She might drink water from a holy well, wear amulets inscribed with prayers, or seek the intercession of saints known for their fertility miracles. The husband, meanwhile, might quietly consult healers or herbalists, though he would never admit the fault might lie with him. Everything, again, was bound up in the belief that unseen forces hovered constantly, watching and weighing the household's fortunes. Superstitions crept even into quarrels. A husband who feared his wife's anger might accuse her of casting the evil eye, an old suspicion that transformed domestic squabbles into whispered tales of witchcraft. A wife whose husband strayed might sprinkle herbs at his doorway or knot threads in secret, hoping to bind his fidelity. These small acts, half pagan, half Christian, stitched together the anxieties of married life. To us, they look like curiosity. To them, they were survival. And through it all, the church pressed forward with its steady insistence that true marriage was a spiritual covenant. The priest thundered about sin, about fidelity, about obedience. Yet outside the stone walls of the parish church, in the cottages and halls, the old customs continued. It was not rebellion but habit. People did not think of themselves as defying God. They thought of themselves as hedging their bets, layering prayers with charms, crossing themselves while tucking rosemary into their sleeves. In this way, medieval marriage reveals something very human. It was solemn and practical, but it was also filled with fear and hope, gestures and rituals that gave people the illusion of control in a precarious world. A vow before God was sacred, yes, but what harm in adding a bell ring, a coin in the shoe, a handful of grain tossed toward the bride? Better to be doubly safe, doubly shielded. So a medieval wedding was not only a union of two people, it was a negotiation with the invisible. Each gesture, each superstition was a small insurance against the unknown. And as the years rolled on, as children came or failed to come, As harvests succeeded or collapsed, the couple would return again and again to these little acts of ritual. They were threads of comfort, binding their private fears to the vast, trembling fabric of the medieval world. After the vows were spoken, after the feast had ended, and after the noise of music and dancing had finally softened into silence, the reality of marriage in the medieval world began. What followed the spectacle was not a quiet honeymoon. There was no such indulgence for most couples, but instead the long business of daily life. Medieval marriage was not primarily about romance. It was about alliances, land, labor, and the careful balance between duty and survival. The vows spoken before God were sacred, but what came after them was endlessly practical, endlessly negotiated, and sometimes endlessly exhausting. For the peasant couple, the morning after was less likely to be filled with tender affection and more likely to involve work. A husband might wake at dawn to tend animals, while his wife rose to prepare bread. Whatever glow lingered from the feast would quickly fade beneath the ordinary weight of chores. Marriage for peasants was an economic partnership above all else. A woman brought her dowry, whether that meant a cow, a patch of land, or a small purse of coins, and in exchange she gained the protection of her husband's household. Both sides had invested in the other, and the return was expected in labor and children. Among the nobility, the stakes were higher, but the principles the same. A noblewoman might bring with her estates, castles, or alliances sealed with her dowry. A nobleman might spend years navigating the politics of such unions, arranging them like chess pieces on the board of power. For them, the wedding was the beginning of strategy rather than its conclusion. A wife's role was to bear heirs, preferably sons, and to secure her husband's lineage. If she also managed to run the household well, to supervise servants, and to act as a competent steward in his absence, so much the better. But marriage was not simply about survival or property, it was also about law. The church's involvement in marriage extended beyond the ceremony itself. Priests and bishops became arbiters in disputes. Was a marriage valid if consent had been coerced? What if consummation had not occurred? These questions carried enormous weight. A union declared invalid could unravel estates and alliances, leaving entire families scrambling to recover. Marriage was not merely personal. It was legal, spiritual, and profoundly communal. The issue of consent was particularly complex. The church taught that mutual consent, freely given, created a valid marriage. A whispered exchange of vows between two people, even without witnesses, could be considered binding in the eyes of God. This made secret marriages a constant source of trouble. Families would discover that a son had already married a girl of lower station in a hushed corner, or that a daughter had pledged herself without permission, and the scandal could ignite lawsuits, annulments, or even violent feuds. For this reason, public ceremonies at the church porch were heavily emphasized. The community needed to see, to hear, to witness the binding words. Privacy was dangerous, yet even with public vows, the lived reality could be rocky. Spousal disputes were common, and the lines of authority, though officially tilted toward the husband, were often blurred in practice. A husband was expected to be head of the household, but a capable wife wielded enormous influence. She managed food stores, cloth production, servants, children, and accounts. In some towns, married women traded in markets or ran workshops alongside their husbands, their names appearing in guild records. The image of the silent, submissive wife is only half the story. Marriage, for many, was a form of partnership negotiated day by day. Still, tensions brewed. Domestic violence, though officially frowned upon, was a fact of life. A husband was permitted to discipline his wife within limits. Too much force, however, could lead to ecclesiastical penalties. Priests preached against cruelty, reminding husbands that their wives were also daughters of God. Yet the imbalance of power was undeniable, and the church, while stern in words, was often hesitant in punishment. Wives who fled abusive husbands sometimes appealed to courts, though success was rare. On the other hand, husbands also complained of wives who were too assertive, too sharp-tongued, too independent. The medieval imagination loved to lampoon the scolding wife, turning her into a stock character of plays, poems, and sermons. To curb such women, humiliating punishments existed: the scold's bridle, the cucking stool, or public shaming in the marketplace. These measures, cruel and absurd as they seem to us, reveal how marriage was not only a private struggle but a performance for the community. A quarrel between spouses was not their own business alone. It threatened the social fabric, and so the entire village took an interest in correcting it. Even when not in conflict, marriage remained a public affair. A couple's fertility, or lack thereof, was openly discussed. If a year passed without pregnancy, whispers grew. The wife might be pitied or blamed. The husband might quietly be mocked. Remedies were sought. herbs, charms, pilgrimages, and sometimes the dubious services of healers who promised to restore potency. A successful conception was celebrated not just by the family but by the whole village, for every child added to the community's strength. In noble households, the stakes were higher. A childless marriage could end dynasties. Pressure to produce heirs weighed heavily on women, and failures were rarely blamed on men. Queens who failed to bear sons faced annulment or disgrace, no matter their other virtues. In contrast, noblemen who strayed from fidelity often faced little consequence, though their affairs might spark tension or scandal. The double standard was as old as the institutions themselves, and yet, within all of this formality, pressure, and scrutiny, there were glimpses of tenderness. Letters survive in which husbands speak fondly of their wives, not merely as mothers of their children, but as companions. A few marriages, by chance, aligned love with duty, and in those unions affection could grow. Couples might share small jokes, quiet prayers, or the daily comfort of working side by side. These moments are rare in the surviving records, but their presence is undeniable. Amid the legalities, the feasts, the property disputes, and the rituals, real human bonds formed bonds not unlike those we recognize today. Marriage in the medieval world was thus a paradox. It was sacred and secular, private and public, tender and transactional. It was shaped by law, by faith, by family, and by fear. It carried the weight of dynasties and the burdens of harvest. And while it rarely resembled the romantic ideals that later centuries would imagine, it was still the framework within which lives unfolded. For peasants and nobles alike, marriage was the stage on which much of existence played out. It is tempting to see only the burdens, the negotiations, and the legal tangles, but marriage was also endurance. Couples weathered famine, plague, childbirth, and war together. They fought, they reconciled, they prayed, they doubted, and they continued. That stubborn continuity, as much as the ceremonies or the superstitions, defined medieval marriage. For in the end, the vows made at the church porch were less about love and more about survival, but sometimes survival itself was the truest form of devotion. Children were the expected fruit of marriage, the natural and necessary consequence of vows spoken before God and community. In the medieval imagination, a marriage without children was like a field that bore no grain, barren, suspect, and deeply troubling. The union of husband and wife was meant to be both spiritual and practical, but above all, it was meant to be fruitful. A couple might exchange tender words at the altar, but if, a year later, no cradle had appeared in their hall, their union was considered incomplete, even dangerous to the order of things. The pressure fell almost entirely on women. A wife who did not conceive quickly was pitted, gossiped about, and often blamed outright. Neighbors might mutter that her womb was cursed or that God was punishing her family. Remedies would be sought with a mixture of faith and desperation. Holy wells and saints' shrines became popular destinations for anxious couples. Pilgrimages were undertaken not out of piety alone, but out of the hope that a relic, a prayer, or a drop of sacred water might unlock fertility. Midwives and healers, too, had their own remedies. Some were practical dietary advice, rest, or the timing of intimacy. Others veered into the mystical. Potions brewed with herbs, charms tied secretly under clothing, whispered incantations meant to coax a reluctant womb into action. Men, meanwhile, rarely bore blame, though everyone knew that childlessness was not always a woman's fault. Still, the dominant assumption was that barrenness lay with the wife, and her social standing would shrink with each passing, empty year. When children did arrive, the celebration was communal. Birth was not a private event, but one woven into the fabric of the village or estate. Neighbors gathered to assist, to witness, and to pray. The cries of a newborn were a sign of hope, not only for the family, but for the entire community. Every child was another pair of hands for the fields, another potential craftsman, soldier, or bride. In noble households, the stakes were even clearer. The infant was a guarantee of inheritance, a safeguard for dynasties, and a promise that the family's name would endure. Yet the joy was tempered by fear, for medieval childhood was precarious. Infant mortality was high, and mothers often faced death in childbirth. A woman might give birth to 10 children and see only half survive to adulthood. This fragility meant that couples were expected to produce as many children as possible, both to secure lineage and to offset inevitable losses. The Church's prohibition on contraception only reinforced this expectation, though in practice, methods of spacing or avoiding pregnancies did exist, whispered among women and frowned upon by priests. Children, once born, became the center of family life. For peasants, they were laborers in training. A boy might follow his father into the fields by the age of 7, while a girl learned spinning, cooking, and tending animals at her mother's side. Childhood was brief, and innocence was not much protected. Work and responsibility arrived swiftly, shaping children into the adults they were expected to become. Yet play was not absent. Toys carved from wood, balls made of rags, and games played in the dirt filled stolen hours between chores. In noble households, the experience differed. Sons of lords might be sent away as pages, beginning their training for knighthood in another household. Daughters, meanwhile, were groomed for marriages that would extend alliance. Their lives were carefully orchestrated long before they reached adolescence. Yet, even in castles, the fragility of childhood was inescapable. Wealth could not shield children from disease, famine, or the unpredictable will of fate. The education of children was uneven, shaped by class, gender, and opportunity. Boys destined for the clergy or for high office might learn to read and write Latin. Some noble daughters received instruction in reading, embroidery, and the management of estates, though this was less common. For peasant children, literacy was rare. The knowledge passed to them was practical, oral, and rooted in survival. Still, in every corner of medieval society, parents poured themselves into the task of preparing their children for the roles they were destined to inherit. Inheritance itself was a constant concern. Land was rarely divided equally, for fragmentation weakened estates. Instead, primogeniture, the practice of granting all or most property to the eldest son, became dominant in many regions. This kept estates intact but left younger sons scrambling for livelihoods. Some joined the church, others took up arms as mercenaries, and still others sought fortunes in trade or by marrying into families of similar rank. Daughters, meanwhile, were often portions to be given away with dowry, their marriages arranged with as much calculation as their brother's inheritance. This system created tension within families. Parents had to balance fairness with strategy, and siblings were often pitted against one another. Resentment brewed when younger children felt cheated or when daughters saw their worth reduced to the value of their dowry. Yet the system endured because inheritance was about survival, not sentiment. Land, like marriage, was too valuable to risk scattering. The role of godparents added another layer of family politics. Choosing godparents was not simply a spiritual act, but a social maneuver. To name a wealthy neighbor or influential lord as your child's godparent was to secure a potential ally, someone bound to your household by both obligation and affection. In this way, even baptism became a negotiation of relationships, another thread woven into the web of alliances that shaped medieval life. Despite the hardships, the laughter of children rang through villages and halls alike. They played, they fought, they sang. They were scolded and cherished, disciplined and loved. Parents, though stern, felt the same anxieties and hopes we recognize today. They worried about sickness, about hunger, about the uncertain futures that awaited their sons and daughters. And in the midst of it, they found joy in small milestones. A first step, a first word, a first harvest worked side by side. The rhythm of medieval family life was unrelenting. Births and deaths came in a steady tide, each shaping the household anew. A widow might remarry swiftly, for survival demanded it. Children from multiple marriages often grew up together, forming blended families long before the term existed. Every union, every child, every inheritance was part of a larger story, one that connected individuals not only to each other but to the continuity of the community itself. In the end, children were the living proof of marriage's success, the embodiment of vows spoken and alliances forged. They carried forward the names, the work, and the hopes of their family. In their fragile bodies and fleeting laughter, the medieval world placed its faith in tomorrow. And though their lives were brief and uncertain, they were the very heart of the medieval marriage contract, the reason behind the dowries, the vows, the inheritances, and the endless negotiation. Marriage was not only about two people, but about generations yet to come, each child another fragile thread in the vast, woven tapestry of medieval survival. Marriage in the medieval world was rarely the private union of two souls. It was more often the deliberate fusing of two families, sometimes two clans, and occasionally even two rival factions forced into uneasy alliance. What we would now call in-laws carried immense weight, not only in domestic life but in the wider politics of survival. When two people exchanged vows, they did not only take each other for better or worse, they also inherited a sprawling constellation of uncles, cousins, siblings, and grandparents, each with their own interests, demands, and peculiar grievances. The web of kinship extended in every direction. Blood ties mattered, but so too did ties of marriage, godparenthood, and patronage. A peasant husband might find his life suddenly complicated by a mother-in-law who expected her opinions to guide his household decision. A noble bride might arrive at her new husband's castle and find herself under the watchful eye of her husband's sisters, each determined to protect their place in the household hierarchy. The merging of families was not seamless. It was tense, negotiated, and often fraught with conflict. Yet kinship was also a lifeline. A medieval village was not a place where one could easily live alone. The extended family was a ready-made network of labor, protection, and survival. Brothers worked the fields together. Sisters spun and baked and mended in a rhythm shared since childhood. A cousin might be called on to witness a contract, lend a cow, or step in during disputes. In-laws might quarrel, but they also stepped up when the household needed extra hands to bring in the harvest or defend the homestead from bandits. Marriage reshaped these obligations. A young woman, leaving her natal home for her husband's household, shifted allegiance from one set of kin to another. This was no small transition. In many parts of Europe, the bride's move was permanent, and she rarely returned to live under her parents' roof. Her new identity was bound to her husband's family. She learned their customs, their rhythms, and often their suspicion. Loyalty was expected, though not always given willingly. Some brides felt perpetually caught between the demands of their parents and the authority of their husband's kin. Letters and gifts might pass between her old family and her new, but physically, she belonged to the household she had married into. In noble society, the stakes were even higher. Entire estates might be reshaped by a marriage, as land and titles passed through dowries and inheritance. This meant that in-laws were not merely meddling relatives. They were power brokers, watchful over how their property was used and who would inherit it next. A lord marrying off his daughter might stipulate exact conditions for her treatment, her rights to dower land, and the standing of her children. The son-in-law who failed to respect these conditions could find himself embroiled in years of bitter lawsuits, disputes that could spill across generations. For peasants, the drama was quieter but no less real. A man might resent the constant presence of his wife's brothers, who turned up regularly to help with work while also criticizing his farming methods. A woman might struggle with her husband's mother, who insisted on managing the household as though she were still the mistress. These were not minor irritations. They were defining features of daily life, shaping quarrels over land use, child rearing, and even the order in which bread was served at the table. Kinship also extended into matters of justice. Family was expected to defend family, whether that meant standing up for a wronged brother in court or seeking vengeance for a slain cousin. Feuds could spiral out of control, dragging in relatives by marriage as well as blood. To marry into another household was, in some sense, to inherit its enemies. A wife might find herself suddenly entangled in a long-standing quarrel she scarcely understood, her children drawn into conflicts begun decades earlier. On the gentler side, kinship brought support during life's upheavals. When a man died, leaving his widow with small children, it was often the in-laws who decided her fate. They might take her back into their household, arrange for her to remarry, or, in harsher cases, seize her dowry land and cast her adrift. The widow's position was precarious, but the network of kin, however flawed, remained the structure within which she had to maneuver. Her own parents and brothers might intervene, but legally and socially, she was bound first to her husband's family. The church, with its endless concern for order, tried to regulate these webs of kinship. Canon law prohibited marriage between close relatives, a rule designed not only to prevent incest, but also to curb the excessive entangling of families into ever tighter knots of alliance. Yet loopholes and dispensations abounded. Wealthy nobles secured papal permissions to marry cousins when the union promised to consolidate land or reinforce loyalty. Peasants, meanwhile, sometimes ignored the rules altogether, especially in remote villages where priests were distant and records scarce. Still, the Church's vigilance reflected its awareness that kinship was not a neutral thing. It could bind society together or tear it apart. Godparenthood added another strand to the kinship net. A child's godparents became spiritual kin, invested with a duty that was both sacred and practical. They were expected to aid in raising the child, to provide guidance, and, if tragedy struck, to step in with material support. Choosing a godparent was a delicate act of diplomacy, often designed to strengthen ties between households. It was a way to create kinship where blood and marriage had not already bound people together. And once chosen, the obligation lingered for life, a constant reminder that family was never merely a matter of birth. Even beyond the immediate family, kinship shaped how marriages were arranged. A young man's cousins might advocate for him, carrying news of eligible brides in neighboring villages. A woman's aunts might broker her dowry negotiations, drawing on their experience and their influence. Entire webs of relatives participated in the process, ensuring that marriage was not just about two individuals but about the harmony or rivalry of whole kin groups. And inevitably, conflict simmered. Jealousies flared when dowries seemed uneven, when inheritances favored one branch of the family over another, or when a favored son-in-law received land that others coveted. Feasts meant to celebrate alliances sometimes ended in disputes, fueled by wine and wounded pride. In-laws became rivals as often as they became allies, and the delicate balance of kinship required constant maintenance. Yet, for all its tensions, kinship provided the medieval world with a safety net. Life was too fragile, too precarious to survive without it. Fields failed, plagues struck, wars ravaged the countryside. In those moments, it was not kings or bishops who provided relief but brothers, cousins, and in-laws. Kinship was both a burden and a blessing, a web that ensnared and sustained at once. To marry was not only to take a spouse, it was to step into that web, to bind oneself to its promises and its perils, and to accept that in the medieval world, no one truly lived alone. In the medieval world, marriage was not only about ceremony, vows, or even kinship alliances. It was fundamentally an economic arrangement. It was a joining of labor, of resources, and of survival strategies in a world where the margin between comfort and hunger was frighteningly thin. To marry was, quite simply, to become a partner in work. For peasants, this meant the endless round of farming, cooking, spinning, and tending animals. For merchants, it meant maintaining accounts, running shops, and cultivating trade connection. For nobles, it meant managing estates, coordinating servants, and ensuring that rents flowed steadily into household coffers. The language of love was rarely spoken. The language of work was universal. The household was the central unit of production. In the absence of modern factories or corporate employers, the home was where nearly all goods were made and managed. A husband's plow and a wife's loom were as essential as a lord's sword. Marriage meant combining these tools, skills, and energies into a single economic machine. It was not enough to say, "I take thee to be my wedded spouse." The unspoken words were, "I take thee to be my partner in labor, in endurance, and in the exhausting cycle of daily tasks." For peasants, the rhythm was dictated by the land. A man might own, or more often rent, a small patch of soil, but he could not till, sow, reap, and thresh it alone. His wife, his children, and sometimes his in-laws were his essential workforce. A wife rose before dawn, preparing bread, milking cows, and spinning wool, all while keeping an eye on children who were soon expected to contribute their own labor. At planting time, she might be in the fields, bent over rows of seedling. At harvest, she wielded a sickle, binding sheaves alongside her husband. The work was never divided neatly into his and hers. Instead, it overlapped, doubled, and blurred, with survival hinging on the coordination of both partners. The idea of the good wife in medieval literature was not merely a moral description but an economic one. A good wife was diligent, frugal, and industrious. She kept her husband's household from ruin by stretching resources, repairing clothes, and brewing ale that could be sold or bartered. To be lazy was not simply a personal failing, it was a financial disaster. A husband might tolerate many things, but he could not tolerate a wife who failed to labor, for her idleness could tip the household into poverty. In turn, husbands were judged not only on their strength in the fields, but on their ability to provide resources, protect their family, and maintain the tools and animals that underpinned the household economy. For artisans and tradesmen in towns, the marriage bond was equally practical. Many guild regulations assumed that a craftsman's wife would be his assistant. A weaver's wife prepared yarn and tended the loom. A brewer's wife brewed alongside her husband or even managed sales at market. A merchant's wife kept the accounts while he traveled, ensuring that debts were collected and inventories maintained. In some towns, widows were allowed to take over their husband's craft license, recognizing that wives had already been essential partners in the trade. To marry, then, was often to secure not just companionship but the guarantee of a skilled and trustworthy business partner. Among the nobility, the stakes of labor were different but no less pressing. A noblewoman was rarely idle, though her work looked unlike that of her peasant counterpart. She managed the great household, ensuring food stores were sufficient, linens were clean, and servants were properly directed. She oversaw accounts, checked on rents, and corresponded with stewards who managed distant estates. She might supervise brewing, baking, and textile production on a grand scale, ensuring that her husband's hall had enough to host retainers and guests. Her skill at estate management was often the difference between a prosperous manor and one slipping into debt. A negligent lady could ruin her husband's reputation as quickly as a negligent knight could. Children were quickly drawn into this shared labor. From as young as 5 or 6, they helped tend animals, gather firewood, fetch water, and scare birds from fields. As they grew, they were apprenticed into the rhythms of household work, daughters spinning, sewing, and assisting with baking, sons plowing, planting, and repairing tools. The medieval household was not a gentle nursery, it was a training ground for survival. Marriage, therefore, was also the mechanism by which this workforce was created and expanded. The seasonal nature of medieval life meant that cooperation was not optional. At harvest time, entire households and often extended kin groups worked side by side from dawn until dusk. In winter, when fields lay dormant, spinning, weaving, and mending occupied every hand. The household was a small factory of survival, and marriage ensured that it did not collapse under the burden of too few workers. And yet, despite this relentless labor, economic tension was inevitable. Husbands might resent wives who held back resources for their natal family. Wives might accuse husbands of wasting money at alehouses or mismanaging plots of land. Disputes over dowry property could poison relations for decades. Even small missteps, a failed batch of ale, a lost sheep, a broken plow, could spark bitter recriminations, for the household survival was always fragile. Still, cooperation remained the ideal. Sermons, ballads, and moral treatises praised the image of a married couple laboring side by side. A husband plowed while his wife sowed seed. He harvested while she bound sheaves. He made shoes while she spun wool. Together they embodied a miniature version of social harmony, the smooth coordination of different but complementary tasks. It was a vision as much aspirational as real, but it served to remind couples that their labor was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Wealthier couples, of course, could buffer themselves with servants, hired laborers, and retainers, but even they were never entirely free of the economic demands of marriage. A lady managing her estates knew that a miscalculation in rent collection could lead to revolt. A lord absent on campaign relied on his wife's diligence to keep the manor functioning. Wealth insulated but did not erase the fact that marriage was, in the end, an institution of labor. The rhythm of marriage was therefore not measured in anniversaries or tender gestures, but in harvests gathered, debts paid, and stores secured for winter. A successful marriage was one in which the household flourished, the animals grew fat, the fields yielded grain, and the children were apprenticed into useful trade. Failure meant hunger, humiliation, or worse, the loss of land, the breaking of kinship bonds, or even the slow erosion of the household into beggary. It is perhaps no wonder that love was rarely the centerpiece of medieval unions. Love was a luxury, a bonus if it came. What mattered more was whether the marriage could withstand the economic grind of daily life. For all the poetry about knights and ladies, the truest medieval love story was far humbler. Two people bent over their shared work, hands chapped, backs aching, yet bound together by the knowledge that without one another, survival was impossible. The night stretched longer than it needed to, as if medieval time itself had been measured not by hours, but by the groan of a timber floor or the distant echo of a dog scratching at its kennel. In houses of stone and wattle, the hearth was the only reliable beacon against the creeping cold. It wasn't just warmth they sought, it was reassurance. Fire was the heartbeat of the home, the faintly orange pulse that reminded everyone inside that the world beyond the walls was indifferent, relentless, and often outright cruel. In wealthier homes, firelight flickered against tapestries embroidered with saints or heraldic beasts, their colors dulled by decades of smoke. Families clustered around the hearth, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging the soft murmur of stories passed down from parents who remembered the Great Famine or a particularly vicious bout of plague. For the servants, it was both a privilege and a necessity to stay near the flames, drying the damp boots, warming frozen fingers, or tending to the occasional cat who had, inexplicably, adopted a fondness for human lap. Cats, in this context, were semi-domestic philosophers. They judged, they warmed, and they slept wherever the temperature gradient seemed optimal. Sleep itself was a negotiated affair. In a world where sickness, rats, and leaky roofs were constants, the concept of a good night's rest was a fantasy sold by poets and the few lucky few who had never known lice-infested mattresses. Feather beds, when present, were layered with straw or hay for structure, sometimes covered by cloth so coarse that modern hands would flinch. The The rich might boast of imported feathers, but even those luxury beds offered no escape from the human, or rodent, disturbances that crept into every corner of the medieval night. The straw, if not replaced often, carried a rich ecosystem of insects, each conducting nocturnal rituals unbeknownst to their human host. Imagine lying in what we would now consider luxury, and feeling tiny, invisible feet scuttle across your arms while the fire casts shadows that seem to mimic the scurrying creatures below. Peasants had a different relationship with beds entirely. Their sleeping arrangements were a blend of pragmatism and stoicism. A single blanket, a handful of straw, sometimes a simple wooden pallet. These were the props for a performance of survival that required more endurance than imagination. Many slept in shifts or staggered schedules, especially during harvest season or when tending to livestock. The cows, sheep, or pigs weren't polite enough to sleep through the night, and a farmer's ear tuned to their lowing and squealing might wake repeatedly, trading brief rest for the demands of survival. Some slept directly on the floorboards, insulating themselves with whatever scraps of cloth or animal pelts could be spared. Comfort, in this context, was less a pursuit than a vague, whispered hope. Noise, too, was a constant companion. The medieval night was not silent. Beyond the animals, there were neighbors, carts, and the occasional traveler shouting down the road. Wood and thatch, however charming in daylight, did little to mute these sounds. Walls were permeable, ceilings less so, and floors often resonated with every clumsy footstep above. Privacy was an indulgence, not a right. Conversations that would now be hushed at bedtime were shouted across rooms, through open doors, or beneath the eaves. Children, if not crying, were giggling or scraping together mischief, often under the dimmest sliver of candlelight. Even the wind had a voice, rattling shutters, tugging at loose roof tiles, whispering through gaps in stone and mortar like a ghost eager to remind inhabitants that nature never truly sleeps. Candles, too, were a complicated luxury. In wealthier households, a few might burn late into the night, dripping wax onto brass holders, providing a steady but flickering light. In peasant homes, the candle was a sacred commodity, rationed, and often extinguished after the evening meal, leaving the room in darkness unless the hearth blazed. Darkness was not empty. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, conjuring shapes that might be rats, spirits, or simply your imagination, emboldened by isolation and the absence of visual reassurance. The mind, deprived of light, tended toward narrative. A creak became a plot. A distant howl became a character in a story no one asked for. Fear, in this context, was ambient, almost decorative, like the scent of burning wood or the tang of sweat from a crowded room. Sleep itself was frequently interrupted. The human bladder, trained over centuries of scarcity and discomfort, dictated schedules that modern plumbing has all but erased from memory. It was common to rise multiple times in the night, to navigate darkness toward a chamber pot tucked near the bed, then return to a nest of blankets and straw. The act of returning, especially when the floor was slick with dew or frost, demanded careful choreography. One misstep could awaken an entire household, or worse, announce to the universe that you were a solitary human against a complex, indifferent night. Many kept slippers or wooden clogs by the bed, not as a fashion statement, but as essential tools in this nightly survival exercise. And then there were dreams or nightmares, which were sometimes indistinguishable from the real horrors that haunted daily life. Dreams in the medieval period were interpreted with a seriousness modern psychology might scoff at. They were warnings, messages, or spiritual evaluation. A dream of rats might not simply be a subconscious reflection of an infestation. It could portend illness. A dream of falling might presage misfortune or death. These interpretations added another layer to sleep. It was never merely rest, but an ongoing negotiation with unseen forces, whether divine, demonic, or just the raw unpredictability of mortality. In towns, the shared sleeping quarters of inns, guild halls, and monasteries introduced their own complexities. Snoring was communal, as were coughs, groans, and the occasional scream of someone who had perhaps eaten too hastily or overindulged in mead. Monks and nuns often divided their nights into watches, alternating between prayer, study, and sleep. Each segment was brief, precise, and interrupted with regularity by bells or the ritual needs of the order. For lay people, nights were less regimented, but no less disciplined. Work dictated sleep schedules, and the unforgiving cycles of seasons and weather left little room for indulgence. Temperature control was minimal. Windows, if they existed at all, were open to the elements, shuttered, or crudely glazed with oiled cloth or horn. A cold draft wasn't an inconvenience, it was a nightly reality. Beds might be positioned to avoid it, but drafts found every gap. Families huddled close, trading body heat, or layered clothing as a substitute for the central heating that would arrive centuries later. The cold was a participant in every night's drama, shaping posture, movement, and dreams. Frost could creep along the edges of even a modestly insulated room, forming silent, sharp patterns on surfaces that, under candlelight, appeared almost artistic in their cruelty. Even the act of waking was calculated. Rising before the first bird call in winter could mean stepping into near darkness, fetching water from a stream, or stoking a fire that had dwindled to embers. In summer, waking too late could mean missing the day's work entirely. The day and night were not separate entities but intertwined adversaries, each demanding attention. Morning arrived not with ceremony, but with negotiation. In medieval homes, dawn was less a gentle awakening than a gradual assertion of the world's demands. Sunlight, if it appeared at all through narrow windows, filtered weakly through grime, dust, or thin cloth, casting muted rectangles across straw-laden floors. The household stirred in stages. First, a groan here, the creak of a floorboard there, a child rubbing sleep from eyes still clouded by dreams of rats, shadows, or mysterious voices. Sleep, even for a few hours, left its residue. Stiff joints, lingering fatigue, and the faintly itchy memory of bedding that had been, at best, semi-hygienic. Water was rarely warm, and running water was almost non-existent. Morning washing was thus a ritual of economy and endurance. In wealthier homes, a basin might be filled with water heated over the hearth, sometimes scented with herbs, which offered a fleeting illusion of cleanliness. Hands, face, and perhaps forearms were carefully scrubbed, but immersion was limited by both the preciousness of water and the practicalities of heating it. For peasants, the ritual was simpler and colder. A splash from a bucket, a brisk rub with a coarse cloth, and the acceptance that true freshness was a luxury. Hair, too, was washed infrequently, and the natural oils, dust, and occasional infestation coexisted in a fashion that modern standards would consider, if not barbaric, at least incomprehensible. Breakfast was another negotiation, this time with the body. It was rare for the day to begin with anything elaborate. Porridge, made from oats or barley, often watered down to stretch a ration, was common. Sometimes it included a bit of milk or the remnants of cheese from the previous day. Bread was dense, coarse, and sometimes riddled with seeds or stones. Sweeteners were rare. Honey was sparing, sugar almost unheard of outside the wealthy elite. The meal was functional. Calories, hydration, and the psychological reassurance that the stomach was not empty. Conversation during breakfast was practical, often punctuated by instructions, reminders, or complaints about chores, livestock, or the weather. Silence was unusual, as families and servants communicated constantly to coordinate the day's work. Clothing followed practicality over fashion, although there were, even in peasant communities, aesthetic choices influenced by custom, superstition, or social expectation. Layers were essential, not optional. Linen shirts absorbed sweat, woolen tunics retained warmth. Belts, pouches, and sturdy shoes were tools, not accessories. Hats, hoods, and cloaks provided protection from wind and rain, while gloves or mittens preserved the fingers necessary for labor. The act of dressing, particularly in the colder months, could be cumbersome. Buttons and laces, fastenings of leather or bone, all demanded patience, and failing to secure a garment properly could mean discomfort or even injury during manual work. The streets outside were alive with motion. Medieval towns had no concept of modern traffic control. Carts, animals, and people shared uneven cobblestones in a chaotic ballet. Market stalls were arranged with a pragmatism that sometimes bordered on improvisation. Barrels, crates, and tables haphazardly aligned to maximize space, sellers calling, bargaining, or shouting warnings to avoid collisions. Livestock moved through alleys, sometimes with their own agenda, sometimes guided by farmers or hired herders who wielded sticks, shouts, and occasional curses. Hygiene, again, was not an afterthought but a series of compromises. Runoff from washing, discarded scraps, and the occasional chamber pot emptied into the street contributed to a reality that was, by modern standards, nothing short of fragrant chaos. Work began almost immediately. Fields demanded attention. Artisans needed raw materials prepared. Merchants required their goods displayed. Tasks were dictated by season, weather, and social hierarchy. Labor was intense, unrelenting, and often dangerous. A scythe or plow was as likely to injure its handler as it was to harvest food. Blacksmiths worked near open flames and molten metal. Weavers contended with sharp tools and heavy looms. Even clerical work, with quills and ink, had its hazards. Ink stains, paper cuts, and the slow strain of sitting hunched over a desk without ergonomic consideration. Work was the central pillar of life. Sleep, meals, and leisure were constructed around it. Children were integrated into this labor economy almost immediately. Play existed, but it was often a simulation of adult tasks, carrying small bundles, tending animals, or helping with basic weaving. Games mimicked reality, preparing young bodies and minds for survival. Education, where available, was a luxury. Monastic schools or wealthy tutors taught reading, writing, or religious instruction, but most peasant children learned by observation, imitation, and direct participation. Knowledge was practical: which plants could be eaten, which ailments were treatable, how to navigate seasonal patterns. Learning was continuous, informal, and inescapably tied to the demands of survival. The midday meal, often the largest of the day, was another exercise in negotiation and pragmatism. Bread, pottage, cheese, and whatever meat could be spared formed the basis. For peasants, meat was a rarity, appearing mostly on Sundays or feast days. Fish was more common in coastal regions or near rivers. Even in the wealthier households, meals were organized meticulously, balancing supply with social expectation. Tables might be laden with multiple courses, yet the dining process was ritualized. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, wine or ale was poured with discretion, and conversation remained controlled. Feasts, in contrast, were chaotic celebrations. Trumpets, minstrels, and the occasional mischief of drunk nobles breaking plates or chasing dogs across the hall. Afternoons blurred the boundaries between labor and social obligation. Tasks continued, and errands multiplied. Markets remained bustling. Tradespeople delivered goods. The occasional messenger or official interrupted the natural rhythm. For women, household management demanded constant attention, supervising servants, maintaining storage of food and firewood, repairing clothing, and tending to children and elderly relatives. Illness or injury amplified these burdens, and the lack of professional medical care meant improvisation and traditional remedies were the norm. Herbs, poultices, and prayers coexisted as dual strategies, one empirical, one spiritual, each reinforcing the other in the fragile dance of survival. Social interaction, too, was framed by pragmatism. Gossip functioned as information exchange, rumors as cautionary tales. Agreements, trades, and marriages were all conducted with a recognition of necessity, survival, and social standing. Humor existed, certainly, often dark or ironic, but it was functional. A shared joke could ease tension, signal allegiance, or defuse conflict. Public spaces were arenas of negotiation, where words carried as much weight as tools or coins, and where miscalculation could lead to insult, injury, or exclusion. The afternoon was also the time when fatigue, insects, and discomfort began to assert themselves more visibly. Hunger returned, muscles ached, and sweat clung to clothing. Flies, mosquitoes, and other small pests were persistent, and coping with them demanded attention and improvisation. Shade, wind, or a borrowed fan, sometimes just a piece of cloth waved with mechanical precision, offered relief. As evening faded into night, one of the subtler, yet ever-present, aspects of medieval life began to assert itself: sound. The human ear, acclimated to a world without insulation or muffling, caught everything. Footsteps across uneven floorboards, the low grumble of a distant river, the intermittent bark of a dog or bray of a donkey, even the shifting of a blanket atop a straw mattress, all became part of the nightly symphony. Silence was almost alien. True quiet was a luxury found only in uninhabited fields or deep forests, places where humans were not the dominant or disruptive species. Within settlements, however modest or grand, noise was constant, interacting with every other element of life: firelight, temperature, pests, and social tension, each contributing to a layered perception of the world that modern ears, dulled by soundproofing, rarely experience. The medieval night was also scented. Air carried the unmistakable perfume of life: smoke from hearths, manure from livestock, the faint tang of human labor, and the occasional bloom of wildflowers carried in by the wind. In towns, odors multiplied exponentially, layering the sweet and the pungent in ways that modern noses, accustomed to deodorized and sanitized environments, might find overwhelming. But these smells were informative. They indicated health, safety, and the presence or absence of neighbors. The scent of smoke, for instance, was a signal that fire was burning and warmth was available. The odor of spoiled food warned of caution, disease, or scarcity. People adapted, training their noses to distinguish helpful cues from mere discomfort, an unconscious literacy of smell that guided behavior, choices, and survival. Darkness, too, was multidimensional. The absence of sunlight was not just a visual phenomenon, but a force that shaped movement, perception, and psychology. Shadows extended across rooms with exaggerated angles, cast by fires or moonlight, animating furniture and walls into fantastical shapes. Shapes became threats or companions, depending on temperament. Medieval people, particularly children, might perceive the corners of their room as inhabited by spirits, or the roof beams as paths for invisible intruders. Folklore, superstition, and religious instruction all informed these perceptions. A shadow might be a devil, a sprite, or a merely mischievous neighbor. The interpretation depended on the observer's experience, education, and willingness to negotiate fear. Darkness was interactive, not passive, a co-author in the narrative of every night. Sleep itself, when it finally arrived, was fragmented. Unlike the uninterrupted 8-hour norm celebrated today, medieval rest was often segmented by necessity or environment. A snore here, a cough there, the whine of an animal, or the creak of timber could awaken sleepers repeatedly. In colder months, rising to stoke a dwindling fire was routine. Moisture collected on floors, condensation dripped from roofs, and bedding was prone to dampness. People developed strategies for these intrusions, shifting position, layering blankets, or huddling together for warmth. Dreams were similarly irregular. They might be influenced by hunger, discomfort, or the persistent noise and activity of the surrounding environment. A dream of a looming shadow could simply be a reaction to a roof beam in moonlight. A vision of falling might reflect the instability of the bedding beneath. Health was never far from the mind. Medieval medicine, still steeped in humoral theory and superstition, offered solutions that were part ritual, part experimentation. A night's discomfort could be interpreted as imbalance, too much phlegm, too little bile, or the restless influence of supernatural forces. Herbs, poultices, and prayers were administered with varying degrees of precision. Families often relied on collective memory and anecdotal evidence. The wise woman or village healer was as crucial as the fire, water, or straw bed, a mediator between human vulnerability and the uncertain forces of nature. Illness was both a nightly threat and a social reality, a reminder that survival was fragile and comfort provisional. Animals were omnipresent participants in the medieval nocturne. Cats hunted small rodents drawn to the warmth of human habitation. Dogs guarded property or companions, sometimes whining at invisible intruders. Livestock, tethered or enclosed nearby, contributed to the sensory experience. Lowing cows, bleating sheep, clattering hooves. Their rhythms dictated human schedules to some degree, signaling when to rise for milking, feeding, or herding. Yet animals also offered comfort. The warmth of a cat curled on a lap or the presence of a loyal dog by the door softened the harsher realities of cold, darkness, and noise. The coexistence was intimate. Humans adapted to animals, animals adapted to humans, and both were subject to the relentless demands of the environment. In urban areas, night brought a different dimension of interaction, the interplay of community and danger. Narrow streets, alleys, and courtyards were illuminated sporadically by torches, lanterns, or moonlight, creating pockets of visibility and shadow. Neighbors were both a resource and a threat. Communities functioned as loosely coordinated networks of observation and intervention. A shout might warn of a thief. A door slammed might signal dispute. Civic regulation existed but was minimal, relying largely on communal norms and the deterrent of public embarrassment. Even in this imperfect system, people developed an acute spatial awareness, learning to navigate not just for efficiency but for safety, avoiding pitfalls, loose stones, and potential conflict in the dim glow of imperfect light. Religion continued to shape nocturnal perception. Bells from nearby churches or monasteries marked canonical hours, structuring both prayer and sleep. Devotion was often intertwined with domestic routines. A quick recitation of psalms before bed, the placement of holy symbols near the sleeping area, or the lighting of a candle as a spiritual safeguard. These rituals served multiple functions. They provided psychological comfort, a structured end to the day, and a communal rhythm that connected households to broader ecclesiastical structures. Faith, in this context, was not optional. It was woven into the sensory and cognitive fabric of daily life, guiding both action and interpretation, particularly in the uncertain darkness of night. Food scarcity influenced nightly routines as well. Meals were dictated by what was available and what could be stored. Bread, cheese, and pottage were staples, with meat reserved for special occasions. Nighttime hunger was common, and those with access to additional rations often faced ethical and practical considerations about sharing with family or livestock. The act of eating, even when minimal, became a careful negotiation of quantity, timing, and opportunity. Hunger shaped dreams, mood, and movement. It also reinforced the importance of planning. Evening preparation for morning work, storage for the coming days, and preservation against unexpected shortages. Noise, light, temperature, health, and ritual converged in a delicate balance, shaping the human experience of night. Medieval nights were rarely restful in the modern sense, yet they were survived through resilience, adaptation, and tacit acceptance. People developed acute sensitivities, the ability to sleep through minor disturbances, detect the approach of danger, or interpret subtle cues from animals, fire, or neighbors. Sleep was a skill. The approach of night in medieval towns and villages was a signal, subtle yet absolute, that the day's business was ending and the day's labor required temporary suspension. Light waned, shadows stretched, and the clamor of commerce gradually softened into the more intimate rhythms of home. For those with the privilege of walls and hearth, there was the comforting, almost ceremonial act of tending the fire. The hearth was not merely a source of warmth but a hub of domestic life, a focus of preparation for the hours to come, and a monitor of the household's well-being. Fire needed attention. Logs carefully stacked, embers stirred, and smoke channeled through chimneys or gaps in the roof, creating a dance of light and shadow across walls and ceilings. In smaller dwellings, the fire was often shared with food preparation, a multifunctional tool that simultaneously cooked, illuminated, and heated. The proximity of fire to straw beds or piled blankets was intentional, but it carried risks that required constant vigilance. Sparks could ignite bedding. Smoke could suffocate inattentive sleepers. The balance between comfort and danger was a nightly negotiation, an understanding of physics and habit that shaped every household's routine. Even in wealthier homes, the same principles applied, though the scale was grander and the resources more forgiving. Larger hearths, fireguards of iron, and servants dedicated to maintaining the equilibrium between heat, light, and safety. Evening meals reflected the social and practical structure of medieval life. Food was as much a matter of survival as it was of etiquette. In peasant households, meals were simple: pottage thickened with grains or legumes, a piece of coarse bread, and perhaps cheese or a small portion of preserved meat. The richness of flavor was secondary to nutritional necessity. Wealthier homes displayed more variety, with multiple courses, imported spices, and meats prepared in complex sauces. Regardless of status, however, the rhythm was similar: food consumed with purpose, conversation held within the bounds of propriety, and the act of eating intertwined with observation of the household's needs and obligations. The transition from day to night also brought about a change in human behavior. People slowed, shifted focus from labor to domestic maintenance, and engaged in small tasks that were impossible during daylight hours. Children tidied, older siblings prepared the next day's clothing or tools, and adults checked stockpiles of firewood, water, and food. Tasks were organized by necessity, influenced by the length of shadows and the diminishing light. Darkness dictated schedule as much as daylight had, and human action was continually moderated by sensory limitation. What could be seen, heard, or felt determined what could be done safely and effectively. Sound played a central role in this temporal transition. Evening was punctuated by familiar noises: the lowing of cattle settling in barns, the rustle of straw, the distant toll of church bells marking canonical hours. Each sound carried meaning. Bells signaled prayer or curfew. Animal noises indicated health or unrest. The creaking of doors and timbers announced human movement. Medieval inhabitants were attuned to these cues, developing an almost instinctive ability to read their environment through auditory signals alone. Awareness of sound was critical, as misinterpretation could lead to missteps, accidents, or missed responsibilities. Nighttime hygiene was modest but deliberate. Water was limited, heat a concern, and cleanliness measured against practicality. Hands and face were washed. Teeth, where attention was given, were rubbed with coarse cloth or herbal powders. Hair was combed or arranged, often infrequently washed, and personal care was closely tied to social expectation, domestic hierarchy, and available resources. The act of preparation for sleep extended beyond physical care, encompassing the arrangement of bedding, the positioning of garments, and the management of heat through layering of blankets or the strategic placement near the hearth. Bed arrangements were similarly dictated by practicality. Beds were rarely individual sanctuaries. They were shared spaces, crowded by family members, sometimes livestock, and always by the reality of environmental limitations. Straw mattresses absorbed moisture and odors, and the layering of blankets was a careful exercise in both warmth and insulation. The proximity of other sleepers demanded negotiation: who would lie nearest the fire, who would receive the outermost blanket, and how to manage the distribution of warmth in a crowded space. Even in wealthier households, with featherbeds and separate chambers, the principle remained: beds were functional, designed to meet physical needs within environmental constraints. The presence of animals in sleeping areas was common. Cats hunted pests drawn to straw, dogs provided security, and small livestock sometimes shared space to conserve warmth. These companions were both pragmatic and comforting, bridging the gap between human vulnerability and environmental challenge. Interaction with animals during the night required attentiveness. Shifts in position to avoid being bitten or clawed, awareness of sudden noises, and sometimes negotiation through gentle physical persuasion. Their warmth was traded for vigilance, an unspoken contract between species. Illness and injury were persistent considerations in nightly routines. Medieval healthcare relied on a combination of herbal remedies, prayers, and observational knowledge. A family member suffering from fever, cough, or injury required care through the night, often involving attention to heat, moisture, and diet. Observation of symptoms, adjustment of bedding, and application of poultices or balms were common practices. Illness, like darkness, demanded constant negotiation and adaptation. The household's survival often depended on attentiveness, improvisation, and the knowledge that human vulnerability could not be ignored, even during sleep. Dreams were influenced by the day's experiences, the physical environment, and social context. Hunger, discomfort, and activity shaped their content, producing vivid or disturbing scenarios. Interpretation of dreams was informed by superstition, religious teaching, and communal knowledge. A restless sleep could indicate imbalance, presage illness, or simply reflect accumulated stress. The act of dreaming, though intangible, was woven into the nightly fabric, as influential in perception and action as physical comfort or the proximity of warmth. Lighting was sparse and highly controlled. Candles and oil lamps were rationed, used primarily for necessary tasks or ritual observances. Excess illumination was wasteful and dangerous. Fire posed constant risk in a world of straw and timber. Limited light extended shadows, emphasized shapes, and contributed to the nocturnal experience, simultaneously revealing and obscuring. Vision at night was an adaptive skill. Humans learned to navigate by partial illumination, relying on memory, touch, and sound to supplement the deficiencies of candlelight or moonlight. The interplay of light and shadow created a world both intimate and unknowable, where perception required continual interpretation. Evening social interaction was practical and ritualized. Families shared stories, observed religious duties, or engaged in quiet work. Conversations reinforced social bonds, communicated obligations, and occasionally provided entertainment.